Let me tell you what my deep research and basically vision is.
I hope there's Bigfoot. I don't think there is.
I'm not telling you nothing.
The aliens won't let it happen. Happening now, breaking.
Bernie Sanders is angry.
Bears beats Battlestar Galactica.
What are the tips? Give me some tips on how to work with Wes Anderson.
Be ready to speak very fast and very clearly, because that's definitely one key thing.
I will only tell the truth. I will only
Until you and 6 kids you barely know in wet bathing suits have surrounded 9 chimpanzees outside of a Wendy's. You probably really don't know yourself, okay?
Yep. And we back.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to your new favorite podcast and the best in political, sports, and paranormal news coverage. I'm your host, Wes Anderson, and this is In the Shed. This is episode 45, so whether you're back for more or finding us for the first time this week, hey, thanks for tuning in. It is late Thursday night, July 21st, and I'm in a shed in the backyard of my home in Alabama, just so I can hang out with you tools and talk about the latest headlines, stories, and rumors in the world of politics, sports, and the paranormal. My guest tonight is broadcaster, researcher, and investigator Darren Schaefer. You may know Darren from his recent appearance on the Netflix phenomenon DB Cooper, Where Are You?, or from the exceptionally well-done podcast he hosts, the Cooper Vortex. Darren, I am thrilled to have you on the show tonight. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, man. I'm stoked to be here.
Yeah, I'm very glad to have you. I've been listening to your podcast. I saw you pop up on the Netflix show when I watched it the other night. I've been meaning to reach out to you for a while and just ask you to be on the show. I thought this would be a great idea for an episode, but I was waiting. We're only 45 episodes in. We average just over 100 listeners an episode. I kind of thought you were too big for us. So when I reached out to you and you were like, hey, I will be on your show tomorrow, it just made my day, man.
I totally know what it's like to be a podcaster and look at my downloads and be like, holy hell, 80 people listened today.
Yeah, and that's exciting. That's incredible. Any of my shows that hit triple digits, I'm like, that was a great show. And I know this one will be too.
Hell yeah.
Well, why don't we just jump right in? We did... actually, our third most popular episode was one in which in our paranormal segment where we talk about paranormal issues and news and conspiracy theories and true crime, we talked about the story of DB Cooper before. So I think most people tuning in will already have a general idea of kind of what happened. But why don't you go ahead and set the scene for us and kind of give us play-by-play detail of what went down back in 1971.
I can do that. I've done this before, so...
Awesome.
The day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971, a guy in a business suit with a briefcase walks into the Portland International Airport. He walks up to the Northwest Orient ticket counter. He purchases a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle. The total cost for the ticket is $20, including tax. He pays with cash. The only identification you needed at that point in time was the gate agent asked him for his name, and he said his name was Dan Cooper, and the gate agent wrote that on the ticket, Dan Cooper.
Dan Cooper, not DB Cooper.
Dan Cooper and DB Cooper, we're going to get into that in a second, but he's one of the last people to board the plane. He sits in the back of the plane, and shortly before takeoff or shortly after takeoff, depending on which account you read, he hands a stewardess a note. And hilariously, the stewardess assumed it was just another businessman hitting on her, so she puts the note in her purse and doesn't look at it. He notices this and says, excuse me, miss, you better have a look at that note. I have a bomb. He's hijacking the plane. By the time they land in Seattle, he wants 2 sets of parachutes, 2 front chutes and 2 back chutes, which would be more commonly referred to by us laymen as 2 primaries and 2 reserves.
Okay.
He wants $200,000. And the airline agrees to his demands. So by the time they land in Seattle, he has the 4 parachutes and $200,000. They bring it onto the plane. They release the passengers. Interestingly, the passengers never knew they were being hijacked.
Wow.
He was able to communicate his demands directly with the flight crew, and everyone involved, agreed, let's keep this to ourselves. So the passengers didn't know the plane was being hijacked until they walked off the plane, or maybe a couple astute ones noticed that money and parachutes were being brought on board. This isn't normal.
Right.
But on the ground in Seattle, he has some very specific demands. He wants to be flown to Mexico City, but not only where to fly, he tells the pilots how to fly the plane. He wants the plane to fly no higher than 10,000 feet. He wants the landing gear down. He wants the plane to fly no faster than 200 miles an hour. He wants the cabin depressurized, and he wants the flaps set 15 degrees. But most importantly, he asks for the plane to take off with the aft stairs down.
Wow.
And he hijacks a Boeing 727, which has these aft stairs or rear stairs, so people can board and deplane using those stairs. This is the early days of, commercial flight travel, and so those planes were designed, they could fly into an airport that was smaller, and they didn't have ramp trucks. They could just use those aft stairs to get people on and off the plane.
Okay, I always wondered what those stairs were for. That's a helpful detail.
It is a helpful detail. And when the pilots hear this, they aren't sure if the plane can even fly with the aft stairs down, nevertheless take off.
Wow.
So they call into air traffic control. Hey, he's asking for this. Is this possible? No one at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport knew if that was possible. So they reach out to Boeing. Hey, can this plane fly with the aft stairs down? And Boeing confirms, yes, it can. We've tested it. That plane can fly with the aft stairs down. And the pilots still refuse to take off with the stairs down. And Cooper says to them, the pilot said it's not safe because on a plane full of fuel, blah, 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 we're not taking off with the aft stairs down. Cooper interestingly said to them, it's possible, but I won't argue with you guys about it. I'll just lower it in flight.
Wow.
So he obviously has knowledge of this plane that the pilots, no one in Seattle had. Boeing had to confirm that with him.
That's incredible.
So with his demands, the pilot said, okay, we don't have enough fuel in that configuration to fly to Mexico City. We're going to have to stop and refuel. They discuss a couple of stops like San Francisco, Yuma, a couple other places, but eventually agree to stop and refuel in Reno. So the plane takes off from Seattle, I want to say like 7:50-ish. And then only one flight attendant on board. She shows him how to lower the aft stairs, which is interesting because he knew they could be lowered, though he knew the plane could be flown that way. But he somehow didn't know how to lower those stairs.
That is interesting.
So she shows him, then tells her, okay, you go back in the cockpit with the rest of the flight crew. No one's on the plane anymore. Sometime, most likely, between like 8:11 and 8:13, there's a pressure bump felt in the cabin. The plane lands in Reno. D.B. Cooper, his money, his briefcase bomb, his notes, none of that is left on the plane.
Wow.
I want to be very clear about this, though, because there are a couple theories I absolutely hate.
Okay.
One is that he never jumped from the plane. He secretly hid on some magical compartment when they landed in Reno, and then was able to just walk off the plane.
Wow.
That's garbage for a number of reasons. The first being the FBI immediately searched the plane with dogs. Have you ever flown in a plane?
Yes.
There isn't a bunch of crazy room on that plane that they're hiding.
That's true.
There aren't hiding spots on an airplane.
How big of a man was D.B. Cooper?
The description that they gave of D.B. Cooper was between like 5'10" and 6 foot.
So big enough
So
that
he
he's not
wasn't
fitting
a
in the
tiny
overhead compartment.
Sometimes there for my camera. How is there room
That's true.
for
Valid.
a man to hide somewhere?
Okay, so he definitely left the plane. That much is a certainty.
Not much of a certainty. The
Okay.
other theory that I really hate. Okay, so Wes, there are two theories that pop up all the time. And like every time a new documentary comes out, people will see it, not know the case, and they have two theories. One is that he never jumped, like we just discussed.
Right.
It's garbage. There's no evidence to support that. It's just not possible.
We throw that one out.
We throw that one right out. The other theory that people come up with right away is D.B. Cooper never existed, and the flight crew was either in on it or some of the flight crew members concocted that.
Whoa.
There's just absolutely no evidence to support that. The flight crew was thoroughly investigated, and also multiple people saw him. So you had passengers on the plane that saw that guy but didn't know to pay attention to him. And then you have the ticket agent that sold him that ticket. And then you had people in the airport that saw him but also were like, yeah, I saw a guy in a suit standing looking out the window. I didn't think anything of it. I can't tell you anything about him. And then while he's on the ground in Seattle, there is also some accounts of either an FBI agent or an FAA agent boarding the plane briefly.
Okay.
So, like, the idea that he didn't exist, it just says you don't know anything about this case.
Well, I was going to play devil's advocate and say, $200,000 back then is, what is that, like a couple million?
$1.25 million today.
Okay, $1.25 million. So I was going to play devil's advocate and say, well, how many people were on the plane? Maybe every person was in on it and they split the money. But I hear what you're saying. If people at the airport saw him, if law enforcement saw him, it's just not plausible.
It's not plausible. Also, like, I've interviewed stewardesses that worked for the airlines in the 60s and 70s. I've talked to pilots that worked in the 60s and 70s. And there's one thing that is totally constant in all of them. All of them said it was an amazing job and it was a great gig. And they were paid well. So the idea that you have three well-paid pilots in the flight crew. You had the pilot, co-pilot, and, I forgot what the name of he's like a navigator or something. I forget the actual title for him. But you have three flight crew, Bill Radizak, Harold Anderson, and William Scott was the other pilot in there.
You said that one of the flight crew's name was Harold Anderson?
Yes.
I have, I've never heard the names before. I have a grandfather that I actually have never met. He left my father and my grandma when my dad was 2, and his name was Harold Anderson.
Did he work for Northwest Orient Airlines?
That I don't know. The last I knew, he lived in the Washington, D.C., Virginia area. I don't know what field he was in. But that, of course, is probably not the same person. But it's a fun thought. I might have a connection here.
We have to check out if he was a pilot.
Yeah, I have to do some what is the Ancestry.com type stuff or something. But sorry for stepping on you. Go ahead.
Oh, no worries. Those are the theories where I'm not even willing to listen. Like,
right.
If you want to tell me right now that you have a theory that Richard Nixon was D.B. Cooper, I'll listen to it. But if you have a theory that the pilots were in on it, I'm not even willing to listen. Yeah,
I agree. I think both of those we can definitely throw out. So what happens? They search the plane. He's certainly not there. He did exist. What happens next?
Okay, I have another fun fact about searching the plane. So they searched the plane with dogs. This is the kind of person that D.B. Cooper was. I'm not sure if he knew this ahead of time, but that flight was the last leg for that flight crew. So they started in Minneapolis and then flew to Montana and then to Seattle. And so that was the end of their workday. And D.B. Cooper, when he does this hijacking, he actually requested meals for the flight crew that remained on board.
Wow.
because they would have to be working longer than they were supposed to, which is interesting. Did he know that or not? I'm not sure the answer to that. But when the plane is searched with dogs, the dogs ate the meals. Because the flight crew didn't do it.
That's
the flight
hilarious.
Crew didn't eat them.
That's funny.
They weren't hungry when they were worried about being blown up and this mysterious dude on the back of the plane.
Yeah, that kind of ruins your
money.
appetite, I would think.
Yeah, it ruins your appetite.
That's hilarious. I've never heard that detail before. I love it.
But so they land in Reno. He's not on board, and basically from there begins the search for Cooper. They had to figure out where he jumped, which we could get into. They sort of have a theory on the proposed drop zone, but also who was this guy? So when the passengers get off the plane, the first thing they obviously do is, let me see the flight manifest, and let's read the names of the people who got off the plane.
Right.
And so the one person who didn't get off the plane was Dan Cooper. And so they immediately, of course, it's probably a fake name, but you have to investigate that first lead.
Sure.
And so they did. And there was a convicted felon in the Portland area who went by D.B. Cooper.
No kidding.
And they just knocked on his door like, hey, bro, did you hijack this plane? And he was like, no, man, I was at home the whole time watching the Trailblazers game.
He's in his pajamas.
So, he's in his pajamas in a trailer park. It's not him. But for whatever reason, there was this media mix-up where someone might have said, hey, we're going to check out this lead, D.B. Cooper. And then the media just went with the hijacker's name was D.B. Cooper.
And once it hits the airwaves, it's just a done deal.
It's a done deal. And this is my opinion. This is not a fact. But I believe the FBI, knowing that the name goes out as D.B. Cooper, they liked that. Because then all the leads, hey, I'm D.B. Cooper, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, if you're saying that, you don't even have the real name of the hijacker.
Yep.
So I think part of it was the FBI had this big detail in their back pocket.
Wow.
Of the real ticket name versus what the media knows.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's good. So do they narrow down kind of a drop zone? Do they start... I mean, that's a giant area. How do they even start searching?
That's a good question. So they felt a pressure bump in the cabin. So he lowers the stairs. They realize that there's a light in the cockpit that lets them know that the stairs are down. But in between like 8:11 and 8:13, depending on the transcript or the account that you're reading, the pilots felt this like pressure bump in their ears in the cockpit where they made note of it. Like, hey, at this time we felt this. We think our passenger might have left.
That was very heads up to make note of the time.
It was, and they were like on, I don't want to say on the phone, they were radioing with Northwest Orient Airlines
Okay.
and the FBI and Air Traffic Control all at the same time. So they were very aware, like, we got to report anything that's going on.
So you would think if they had a general idea of about when the stairs came down and when he jumped, I mean, I would think as soon as they radio in and say, hey, he might have just left the plane, I mean, I wouldn't think it would take very long to have every police officer and FBI agent, in that whole general area with flashlights and dogs, and to begin the search. Is that what happened?
Absolutely not, Wes. You're totally wrong about that. So here is what actually happened. So the plane lands in Reno. They have this information. Northwest Orient and the Air Force, because they had this SAGE radar system. I wish I could tell you what that acronym stood for. I was air, ground. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend I know. But on the West Coast, they had this super advanced radar system that was designed to like detect threats from Japan and the Soviet Union. And so they used that radar system to track the flight of the plane.
Wow.
And interestingly, they have this pressure bump at this timestamp. So what they did was they took the exact same plane, not the same type of plane. They took the same actual plane, the plane Cooper hijacked, and they flew it over the ocean, dropped the stairs at around 10,000 feet, and pushed a 200-pound sled out the back to see if it would recreate that pressure bump that the pilots felt.
Wow.
And it did.
Wow.
So they're confident in about the time Cooper left the plane.
Mm-hmm.
Which then leads you to the FBI's proposed drop zone, which is like Ariel, Amboy, Yakult, Washington area.
Okay.
Sort of in the middle of nowhere. There are tiny towns in that area, but there's not like a city there.
So he just out of the plane, middle of the night. Everything I've always read said that it was kind of an overcast, stormy night.
It was definitely overcast. It's always overcast in that area of the
True.
Pacific Northwest. I lived there. But here's one thing I want people to understand, is because people will say, oh, yeah, it was a stormy night. No, it wasn't a stormy night. It was like a stereotypical November night in the Pacific Northwest. It's raining.
Okay.
And if you live in Alabama or Colorado, or if you live in Florida and you hear it's raining, you picture a storm automatically.
Yep.
Because that's when it rains.
Yep.
But in the Pacific Northwest there, you get this light rain all day long that doesn't let up. And that's what was going on at the time. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't anything crazy. The weather wasn't insane. People say, it was minus 10 degrees where he jumped. Okay, yeah, it was minus 10 degrees where he jumped. But it was 45 degrees on the ground.
Oh, that's
that
not
night.
bad. That's not bad.
So if it's minus 10 degrees, it's going to be minus 10 degrees for a couple hundred feet. And when you're jumping out of a plane, that goes by pretty quick.
See, this is that's important information to know because anybody that I talk to that has about the same background knowledge as I do about this or less, the first thing that is said is he didn't survive the jump. There's no way. It was too dark. It was too rainy. It was too this and that, and he definitely just died. Do you think there's a pretty decent chance that he made the jump successfully?
I would, in my opinion, I'm saying 95% he survived the jump.
Wow.
And that's not like something I just came up with on my own. But if you are debating whether or not he survived the jump, I would very much recommend the book Finding D.B. Cooper, Chasing the Last Lead by Martin Andrade. The whole book just basically debates whether or not the jump is survivable.
Okay.
And one thing Marty does really well in that book is he compares World War II ejections in Europe against D.B. Cooper's survivability odds. And so you have these ejections in World War II where many soldiers would have had maybe one practice jump, and most of them would have had only classroom training on how to use a parachute. And their planes are shot, blown up at night over who knows what conditions, and they're bailing out of a tumbling plane. And their survivability rate, like if they pull the ripcord, their survivability rate's like 99%.
Wow.
And whether or not they pull the ripcord, their survivability rate's like 95. The biggest thing is like, you don't pull the ripcord, you're dead.
Yeah.
But if you pull that ripcord, there is a really good chance that you're going to live.
So that's interesting because I always kind of had in my mind, if he survived, it's sort of 50-50 or 60-40. But even just hearing you say that, I'm kind of like, okay, D.B. Cooper lived through the jump. That's very interesting. So what happens then?
I really think he did live through the jump.
Yeah.
Another thing is the debate of how forested the area is. And I live there. The woods there are thick. They're tremendous. I'm not going to lie about that. But, I mean, in the drop zone, it's probably like a 50% chance of landing in the woods. A lot of farmland out there.
Yeah.
So that's totally fine. Also, the idea that he lands in water
Yep, I've heard that.
and drowns. I mean, really the first thing you have to do, if that's your argument, is figure out what percentage of land versus water there is in that area. And in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of water. But it's probably like 99% land.
Yeah.
So there's a 1% chance he lands in water. If he pulls his parachute, he's and hung up in a tree or in the water, he's found right away. And they searched that area with helicopters. They searched it with the SSR-71 Blackbird. They searched it with small planes. There weren't any parachutes hung up in trees. So the debate is really not whether he survived the jump, in my opinion. The debate is whether or not he's a no-pull. And I don't think he doesn't pull his ripcord.
So how long after he jumps out of the plane is it until there are boots on the ground, helicopters overhead, and they're actually searching the area? Do we know that?
Oh, I know that. That's what the question was, but I had a few drinks with dinner, so I lost track. But the boots on the ground, there aren't really boots on the ground for like 72 hours.
72 hours?
They didn't know exactly where he jumped. So immediately you have planes and helicopters going over and near the flight path looking for parachutes. But boots on the ground where they believe he jumped, I don't think there was any police force in the area for at least 40 hours, and there wasn't people actively looking in that area, I would say, for 72.
Darren, that's days.
That's days. And also, in that area, you start to have snowfall in December, so it really makes, like, searching an area for a dead body ridiculous. So there wasn't a massive ground search until, I believe it was early March. So
wow.
At that point now, he has 4 months. If he was, like, hiding out in the woods. But I don't believe that's the case.
Yeah, I would think
But
even just a couple of days would be.
300 volunteers plus, like, police, National Guard, firefighters, that ended up, like, stomping through the woods in that drop zone looking for evidence of a body. And they found 2 bodies. Neither one was Cooper.
They found 2
One
bodies.
was like a Native American, I believe, teenage girl that had been missing for like 10 years.
Oh my gosh.
And the other was a young man who was a murder suspect fairly recently, I believe.
This is why I have you on the show, because this is the stuff that I've never heard before, that they found bodies while searching, but none of them were D.B. Cooper.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow. So they didn't find a body. They didn't find a parachute. They're reasonably confident that Dan Cooper was not actually his name, and the mystery abounds. We're going to get into the details of the mystery, possible suspects, all of the good stuff about the story. That's kind of the ins and outs and the backdrop of what happened. But first, I'd love to hear from you how you even became interested in this story to begin with.
I became interested in it. I grew up in Woodland, so I remember the first time hearing about D.B. Cooper was on a rerun of Unsolved Mysteries. I was like watching it with my sister, and I remember it starting out like he bought a ticket at Portland International Airport, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's so close to us!" And then it was like, "Oh yeah, he jumped out of the plane near Woodland, Washington." I was like, "Holy hell, that's right here!" And so I was always just like sort of interested in it being a local story. And then I went to the aerial store to go to D.B. Cooper days. I think it was twice before I was crazy interested in it.
And that's like is that the convention?
That was the convention back in the day.
Okay, cool.
That was the convention back in the day. My wife bought me a copy of this book, Skyjack, by Jeffrey Gray.
I've heard of it, haven't read it yet.
And I got it, and I was like, cool, a D.B. Cooper book. And I didn't do anything with it for a few months. And I was traveling to my parents' house, and I just picked a book off our bookshelf to read while I was traveling, and I picked Skyjack. And I started reading that book, and I was like, oh my God, this case is so much crazier than I even knew, and there's this and there's that. And in Skyjack, there was a reference to someone that was helping him investigate the case. And he was like, the guy said he's not going to help me anymore because he wants to write his own book. And so I remember thinking, reading that, this book is a few years old. I wonder if that book is out. And it was. It was Into the Blast by Robert Blevins and Skip Porteous. So I ordered that book on Amazon. And reading that, it talked about this other researcher who had his own book. So I was like, well, shit, I should get that book too. And that was Bruce Smith's D.B. Cooper and the FBI.
Was he one of the first guests you had on your podcast?
Yeah, I've had Bruce on my podcast a bunch of times.
Okay.
And Robert Blevins.
Okay, I remember the episodes with him. They were very well done.
Bruce is awesome.
Yeah.
And when I read that book, I was like, this is so much crazier. I have to read everything I can find on it. I started getting on the forums. I was crazy interested in it. And then probably like 2 or 3 months after this, where I'm like so obsessed with the case, I started working this job where I work completely alone. And I listen to 40 to 60 hours a week of podcasts and talk radio.
Yep.
So I looked up on Apple Podcasts D.B. Cooper. And sure enough, and this is like 2016, 2017.
Okay.
And there were 40 different shows that had done a D.B. Cooper episode. And so I was like, well, I'm just going to burn through all these. This is exactly what I want. And I found out real quick they were all the exact same thing. It was 2 or 3 hosts drinking wine, discussing true crime. And they would cover the hijacking in 20 minutes. They would go through 4 different suspects in 20 minutes. And then in the last 5 minutes, they would decide who they thought was D.B. Cooper. You're describing
the episode that we did on that was our episode that we did on, but that's why I'm following up with having you on so that we can go deep.
But I was just like so unsatisfied with that because I had read all these books by this point.
Yeah.
Like I started fast forwarding through the hijacking on these podcasts just so I could listen to their interpretation of the suspects.
So by that point, you were...
I'm crazy. I'm absolutely crazy.
You were deep in the rabbit hole.
That's the important part. But I'm deep into it. And it was at that point where I was like, you know what? I think I could do a better show about D.B. Cooper. I really wanted to hear a long-form interview with the authors of these books.
Yeah.
And with the people that were arguing online about this all day long. And so I was like, okay, here's my plan for the show. It could work, but I want to get at least these 2 people in. And the 2 people that I was like, there's no show without these guys, were Bruce Smith and Robert Blevins. So I reached out at that point to 5 people in Washington State. I lived in Idaho at the time.
Okay.
And I was like, hey, I'm going to create this show about D.B. Cooper. Do you want to be involved? And I thought if I could just get a couple of these people to say yes, I'll do the show. Let's see what happens. All 5 of them immediately said, yes, I'd love to be involved in your show that doesn't exist. And so I bought some podcasting gear, loaded it in my car, drove to Washington, did all 5 of my first interviews in person, and sat on that for months. Like I couldn't finish it. I wanted like a cheesy Unsolved Mysteries vibe to the show, but I couldn't pull it off. And it was just bugging me. But I knew this guy who went to school for audio and visual production, and he wanted to be doing that, but he was doing something else. So I reached out to him. His name's Russell Colbert. And I was like, I met him at this bar, and I was like, hey, dude, I started this podcast, and I can't finish it, and I need some help. I have nothing to offer you, except I could put your name on it if you want.
Love it.
And he was stoked. He was like, yeah, I'd love to be involved in something like that, and I could easily do that. So I sent those interviews off to him. I was like, hey, Russell, here you go. And what I got back was like exactly what I wanted this show to be.
Very cool. Very cool. I love it.
Cool.
I love it. And
Russell's the man.
I did shout out to Russell. I watched that episode. I think Unsolved Mysteries, the OG episodes with Robert Stack, that man just gave me the creeps as a child. Everything he did I found interesting. And I think that's where I first heard the story of D.B. Cooper as well. And one thing I love about your podcast, as I'm almost through, I actually listened to an episode when I cut the grass today. And I like that you will have conversations that stray way away from the mainstream, and you will consider every possibility as a valid option, which I think when you're talking about a mystery is very important.
Well, that's what I've tried to do with the show, is like every episode is standalone. Like if you want to listen to episode 37 as your first one or episode 1, it doesn't matter. For the most part, they're all standalone. Occasionally I have a guest that will like reference, oh yeah, when you had so-and-so on your show, they said this.
Yeah.
But I don't know who D.B. Cooper is. And I've had guests on that are very confident they know.
Yeah.
And so the point of my show isn't I'm telling you who D.B. Cooper is. The point of my show is I'm talking to these people, and you decide who you think D.B. Cooper is.
I love it.
Because I don't know.
Yeah, and it's so funny to me how many people that are involved who have gone deep down the rabbit hole with this whole D.B. Cooper. You're in rare air, because most people, they have a suspect they've zeroed in on, and they are certain that that is D.B. Cooper.
For sure. I've had Eric Eulis was on my show. Gosh, it was probably 4 years ago or something now, but I interviewed him in this hotel room, and I remember he walked into the room and he sits down and he looks at me and he says, I know you've heard this before, but I believe I've solved this case. And it was just so great. And like, he and I will laugh about that now because he doesn't even believe what he believed at the time.
Yep.
But that is something that I've heard quite a few times.
I bet. Very cool. Well, let's jump into some of the questions that I have about this whole thing. Let's get to some details. First off, why don't you you've mentioned some of this already, but why don't you just let us know, what do we know about D.B. Cooper? What was the description given of him by folks that saw him aboard the plane, that sat near him, by flight attendants? What do we know?
What we know about him from the description that we've got from flight attendants and a few other people that saw him, he's between like 5'10" and 6 foot. He's described as having olive or swarthy skin.
Okay.
Maybe a dark tan. He's not described as being white.
Okay, so kind of like the skin of Christ.
Yeah, I've even seen some people like possibly of Mexican or Hispanic descent.
Wow.
Possibly Native American descent. You wouldn't describe him as exactly white.
Mm-hmm.
But brown eyes. Some accounts he has tobacco-stained fingers, which is only worth bringing up because there are suspects that people propose that don't smoke, which I find laughable. Also, like, the sketch. That's really what people want to talk about, the sketch. He's described as being mid to late 40s,
okay,
which is a very unusual age for someone to do a crazy, daring crime.
It really is.
Usually your robberies, your insane crimes, it's males in their 20s.
Right.
Not males in their 40s. But the sketch and what he was wearing, that's one thing where you could put anyone in there, because in 1971, what percentage of men had military experience? Most of them.
Yeah.
Vietnam was going on. The Korean War was over. World War II was over. Most men had military experience. In 1971, if you're flying on a plane, what percentage of men wore a suit? very high. It's not like today where the guy sitting next to me is wearing pajama pants and a cut-off tuxedo T-shirt.
Right.
People dressed up for a flight back then.
Which is kind of funny.
A suit wasn't necessarily unusual. In 1971, men between 35 and 50 all had pretty much the same haircut.
Right.
So the sketch is very generic and vague, and you can fit a lot of dudes. I mean, look up a picture of your grandpa, Wes.
Yeah.
I bet he's a close match to the sketch.
He might be. The sketch kind of looks like the Jehovah's Witness gentleman that knocked on my door a couple weeks ago. So.
Yeah, and another thing I bring up on the show quite often is that there were two main versions of the sketch released, and they look different.
Wow.
So you have the original sketch that was released, which in the Cooper world we refer to as the Bing Crosby sketch, which is the black and white one. His face is a little bit slimmer. It's done both with sunglasses and without, which I love. And then you have the sketch that came out, I want to say it was like 18 months after the first one, which in the Cooper world we refer to as the Cary Grant sketch, which you usually see in color. His face is a little bit wider. I believe the fact that they came out with two different sketches that looked dissimilar did a lot of disservice to the case.
Yeah.
Because it's two different people. You can't, if you look at the first sketch and the second sketch, those are different dudes. And what's up with that?
So do we know what the disparity between the two? Were they from different reports or from different people? How did they come to two different ideas?
That's been, there's a great book by Nat LaFoque called D.B. Cooper Examined, Identified, and Exposed. And that book has like a dedicated chapter about the sketches. And I'm paraphrasing here, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but from my understanding, the first sketch that came out had a lot of influence from Tina Mucklow, but Florence Schaffner, who saw Cooper earlier than Tina Mucklow did, she disagreed with the sketch.
Wow.
And so because they weren't getting enough action from the first one, they decided to redo it with different people.
Wow, that's interesting.
And so, yeah, it is weird.
It is weird. So obviously, D.B. Cooper, Dan Cooper, whoever he was, he knew a lot about planes.
More than the pilots.
The detail that you shared about how the pilots were not even sure it was possible for the plane to take off with the aft stairs down, that's not something that I'm familiar with, and that kind of blows my mind.
Here's another tidbit for you. So the pilots refused to take off with the aft stairs down, like we discussed.
Right.
Cooper lowered them in flight. The plane flew no problem. They landed at Reno with the aft stairs down, and of course it did damage to the aft stairs. But the pilot stating the plane could not take off with it, there is a YouTube video. Oh, gosh, this is an important detail I'm missing. There's a YouTube video where people are, like, fleeing some country, like the Philippines or Vietnam or somewhere over there. It'd be great if I knew this, but I don't. But there's a YouTube video of a 727 taking off with the rear stairs down.
Wow.
And people trying to run aboard those rear stairs. So there's video evidence of that plane being able to take off with the aft stairs down.
Wow.
Cooper knew it. Interestingly, I'm not going to argue with you guys about it. I'll just lower him in flight.
Man, so he knew a lot about planes. He obviously had some experience or at least knowledge of parachuting. Why do we have an idea of why he asked for so many parachutes?
We don't. But my opinion, and it's generally agreed upon, so I wouldn't say it's my opinion, but he asks for 2 sets of parachutes. Most people, including myself, believe it's because the FBI then has to assume that he's going to take a passenger or a stewardess with him out of the plane.
Wow.
So if he's doing that, if he's forcing a stewardess to jump with him, and the FBI sabotages both parachutes, the FBI just murdered the stewardess.
Wow.
So if he asks for multiple, the FBI cannot sabotage them because then they are directly killing the person that he takes with him.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. It really seems, the more that I learn about this case, this was a very, very well thought out crime.
I sure think so. I mean, the people that spend their lives researching this believe it was well thought out and well planned.
Do you think that D.B. Cooper had prior knowledge of the area that he jumped out of the plane? Was he familiar, and do you think he had gone so far as to do research about where he wanted to leave the plane?
I do. In the air, he recognized that's Tacoma down there when they were circling SeaTac.
Wow.
And then also he complained about the delay in getting the parachutes and the money. And he was like, McCord Air Force Base is only 20 minutes away.
Oh, wow. No kidding. No kidding.
Yeah.
So he had familiarity with the area for sure.
He had familiarity with the area, I believe.
Wow.
And then, regarding him knowing more about the plane and the pilots, there was a group of people who knew that 727 could be jumped from because the CIA was doing these covert missions in Vietnam with 727s where people would recognize that plane as a commercial aircraft and not as a military aircraft. But the CIA could use it to drop gear and potentially people out of the aft stairs.
And we're off. Now we've dropped one of the three-letter terms here, CIA. Wow. Okay. You're blowing my mind, Darren. You're blowing my mind already.
That really was the only people who knew that plane could be jumped. Because skydivers at that time, which I've spoken to, people who were sport parachutists in the late 60s, early 70s, thought that jumping from a jet was impossible. So the people doing it for fun and as a hobby assumed it wasn't possible.
But D.B. Cooper...
But there was a small CIA component in Vietnam that was actively doing it.
So either D.B. Cooper knew that it was possible or he was taking a very big chance.
He was taking a very big chance. I don't even believe that. The idea that he didn't know you could jump from that plane, I don't believe it. There was no internet back then.
Right.
It's not like, Wes, you could go to a library today and see if you could open the door of an Amtrak train while it's running.
Yep.
Unless you know. There isn't another way to find out.
Yeah, I certainly would not have had any interest in making that jump, $200,000 or not, if I did not already know that it was possible. And maybe if I'd already done it.
The other thing that bugs me is people assume like he didn't know how to parachute. And there was a copycat skyjacker who didn't know how to parachute and asked for instructions.
Oh my gosh.
With his parachute. And believe it or not, he made it to the ground safely.
Wow.
But the idea that Cooper didn't know how to parachute, I find laughable. He knew the plane could be jumped.
Yep.
He asked for the equipment. He got the equipment. He jumped from the back of the plane. Wes, how much experience do you have piloting submarines?
0, Darren. 0.
0. Okay. So would you plan and commit a crime where your only escape is by submarine?
I would not. No. I would not.
If you don't know how to parachute and no one knows this plane is jumpable.
Yeah.
Are you doing that?
Absolutely not. Definitely not. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. He obviously had knowledge, if not experience, with these things. What about this, Darren? I've heard a couple of places, and I don't know how this checks out. I'm sure that you've researched this in the past. I've heard it described that the FBI had a lot of trouble getting an accurate passenger list, that they could not figure out who was and who was not even on this plane during their investigation. Have you come across that before?
No, I would say that's entirely not true. They had the flight manifest in Seattle on the ground. It was the very first thing they did was compare the names of passengers to who got off the plane.
Okay.
I just completely disagree with that. There's no truth to that.
And how many people were on the plane?
Not many. That's another thing that's sort of interesting. I want to say there was like 36 people on the plane, something like that. A Boeing 727 is a smaller plane than what you and I would be used to today, but it was small.
Okay.
But you also have to think at that time they were running flights where you could actually walk onto the plane with no ticket and pay your fare in the air.
Wow.
So it wasn't like this every flight is sold out, it's shocking to have no one in the seat next to you kind of a thing.
Yeah.
This is the early days of air travel.
This is the early days.
Short flight from Portland to Seattle.
Yeah, it was what, an hour and a half?
Oh, no, it was like 45 minutes.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How far are Portland and Seattle by car?
Portland and Seattle, are we talking traffic, no traffic, or just mileage? Mileage, I would say it's got to be like right around 200 miles.
Oh, wow, okay. A lot closer than I realized.
Yeah, they're pretty close. By car today, it's probably going to be like 3.5 hours.
Not bad at all. So people, I mean, this was you could just drive. It's not even really a flight that you're just taking this flight for pure convenience only.
Absolutely.
Okay. And is it true that there actually was a passenger on board the flight who also had the last name Cooper?
That is true. I want to say his name is Michael Cooper.
Any connection?
Don't quote me on that, but there was a passenger on board with the last name Cooper.
Any possible connection?
No possible connection. It'd be like there was a guy whose last name was Smith or Johnson or Washington. It's just a common last name.
It is a pretty coincidental thing, though.
It is. I've seen a couple of people briefly look at that passenger, and really, there's nothing to that.
Okay. I will certainly take your word for it. So one of the times that you had Bruce, remind me his last name? Bruce Smith, right. One of the times that you had him on your show, I remember him coming out with something that I have not heard anywhere else. I haven't read it, haven't seen it in print. He's the only one that I personally have ever heard say that he talked to passengers who were on the plane, and that the story that they gave was entirely different than the one presented by the FBI.
That's definitely a Bruce Smith thing to say.
Okay.
I love Bruce. I trust Bruce 100%. I don't have anything to back that up. It's probably Bruce referring to like some specific thing, but I don't know exactly what he's talking about.
So generally, the passengers described D.B. Cooper as being polite and being kind, and they didn't even know that.
The passengers didn't describe him as that. None of the passengers gave a description of him.
Really?
The only passenger that gave a description of him was Bill Mitchell.
Okay.
And Bill Mitchell was sitting across the aisle from him in the back of the plane. And when the commotion started with the flight attendants, and remember again, none of the passengers knew this plane was being hijacked. Bill Mitchell, who was 21, 23, something like that, at the time he was flying back home from Oregon State University, and his recollection is that he looks over and there's this, in his terms, geeky looking guy and a hot young stewardess sitting next to him the whole time, and she's lighting his cigarettes for him. And Bill thought to himself, why is she paying attention to this geeky-looking guy? I'm way cooler than him. And that's his recollection of D.B. Cooper.
That's so funny.
He didn't know to think this guy's important, I should pay attention to him. His thought was, this guy's a loser. Why is this hot young gal talking to him instead of me?
Wow. So
he is really the only passenger that has really any description of him. The stewardesses, Tina Mucklow, she sat next to him for the majority of the flight. She has almost 5 hours experience hanging out with D.B. Cooper. And she described him immediately after the flight as always kind, never rude, and he became annoyed at one point on the ground in Seattle, but he was never rude or unkind to her.
Okay, so those descriptions about him as a person all came from flight attendants and the crew.
Yes, primarily Tina Mucklow. So Florence Schaffner is the one that he handed the note to, and this is just my interpretation of all of the things I've read, but Florence Schaffner basically lost it when he hands her that note. Understandably so.
Sure.
And Tina Mucklow essentially takes over, like, Florence, it's okay, I got this.
Very interesting.
So Tina Mucklow had the most, by far, interaction with him. So most accounts of Cooper are from Tina Mucklow, who describes him as essentially calm, cool, and collected the whole time, which really
is bizarre.
Says a lot about him.
It's bizarre.
It's very bizarre. And in my opinion, it really speaks to the kind of person that he is. I'm sort of the... I tend to believe that he was Special Forces. Because the ability to plan something like this and execute it is one thing, but the ability to remain calm while you're doing it, I think, is a completely different thing.
No kidding. That's wild. It really is. And the flight attendant
you do have copycat skyjackers,
right?
Like Richard McCoy. And Richard McCoy was a Green Beret, decorated soldier, a badass by all standards of measurement, and he was a mess. He was a mess for his skyjacking and drew attention to himself.
Yeah.
Cooper never drew attention to himself and was calm, cool, and collected the whole time.
That's incredible. And I'm sure the flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, is that her name, that sat with him?
Yeah.
I'm sure that she was thoroughly investigated and vetted by the FBI to make sure that she had no connection to the crime?
She was. I read an account of her ex-husband, I believe, or ex-boyfriend, but he said that he believed they were being followed months after the skyjacking. And there is no evidence to indicate Tina Mucklow in anything. I want to be clear on that. I think Tina Mucklow is a badass.
Yeah.
And the fact that she was able to handle this so coolly, I have mad respect for her.
Yeah, no kidding.
She's great.
And is it her? I remember seeing an interview a while back. It's been some time now, with either her or Schaffner, Mrs. Schaffner, and whichever one of them was, talked about having to this day having PTSD because of the experience. Do you recall an interview like that, and which one it might have been?
It wasn't Mucklow, because Tina Mucklow has specifically said she doesn't have PTSD about the skyjacking, but she's been very annoyed by the attention she gets for it.
I can see
understand.
That. Yeah.
And that's another reason, I've harassed every single person in the D.B. Cooper game except for her.
Yeah.
I've never once reached out to her. I've never tried to contact her. It's just, I don't want to be... She mentions, all these men, harass me about D.B. Cooper. I don't want to be one of those men.
Yeah.
So I've never done that.
Yeah, I don't blame you. That's a list that we don't want to add our names to for sure.
No, and Florence Schaffner was on Unsolved Mysteries. No, not Unsolved Mysteries. Or maybe it was. Lawrence Schaffner was either on Unsolved Mysteries or In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy. And it's a great interview. I can't remember if she said she has PTSD from this or not.
Okay. Bruce Smith mentioned...
It's 1971.
Yeah.
So the chicks back then, the people back then, they were tougher.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
all of those stewardesses and the flight crew continued to work for the airlines, for a period of time after.
No kidding.
So it wasn't like this happened and this is the end of my airline career.
Yeah, I think it would have been for me. I think I would have quit the next day. I'm like, somebody claimed they have a bomb. I don't care what my job is. I'm out. I'm done. I remember Bruce Smith on your show. He mentioned some claim of there being some type of impropriety or some type of advanced
sexual assault.
Yeah, that was possibly made by D.B. Cooper toward one of the flight attendants. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it would have been Tina Mucklow.
Okay.
That's a detail that I don't repeat, and I'm unsure of.
Okay.
So there have been two people that told me that story. One was Bruce Smith, that potentially D.B. Cooper was aggressive or sexually inappropriate with Tina Mucklow. Bruce Smith told me that. And then interestingly, Greg Gossett said the same thing. And Greg Gossett was saying it about his father, William Gossett or Wolfgang Gossett, which is a suspect that I do not discount. And it's very interesting to me, but at the same time, if you were just sexually assaulted, do you say the guy was polite?
Right.
In an interview 10 minutes after?
Yeah. I probably not. Yeah, that's something I remember. The only place I ever heard that was when Bruce Smith said it on your podcast, and it's always stuck with me. But that's, like I said, that's the only place I've ever heard it before. And based on her description and the other descriptions I've heard of D.B. Cooper, it seemed like for the most part everybody on board the plane felt safe, even though he claimed to have a bomb, or at least as much as you can when someone claims to have a bomb.
Yeah, and Wes, I truly believe the only place you are going to hear that is on my show.
Yeah.
I'm not, this is me bragging.
Go for it, Darren.
I've talked to a couple more people involved in this case than most.
Yeah.
And I've only heard that from those two people. And when Bruce said it, I was just like, I don't know what the hell to think about this. But when Greg said it, and he was like, yeah, my dad was a piece of shit. He was a womanizer, blah, blah, blah. So, I don't know. If it is gossip, maybe there is something to that.
Yeah.
I believe Greg was like, I don't want to butcher a quote from my own show, but I believe Greg was like, he made out with her, and Bruce said sexual assault.
Okay.
But I really don't know. That there's nothing to back either of those claims up.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not like putting my name on D.B. Cooper was this. I mean, really the story is he didn't hurt anyone.
Yeah.
Which I would rather believe than, right before he jumped out of the plane, he molested some chick.
Yeah, and that was the fact that no one was harmed was it was unlike any other hijacking that had happened at the time. Both that he didn't get caught, but also a lot of times those things did not end well. Is that correct?
Usually they didn't end well for the hijacker.
Okay.
I get my copycats mixed up, but there was, so I won't say a name, but there was one attempted hijacker, essentially like D.B. Cooper. He wanted $500,000, but a very badass stewardess spiked his drink with a handful of Valium.
Wow.
And so he starts this negotiation with police like, give me $500,000 or everyone dies. And after the Valium, it devolved to, and this is no joke, I want 2 cheeseburgers and a 30-second head start. And
oh, man.
they say, okay, fine, here's your rental car, are 2 cheeseburgers in there. Just walk off the plane. And when he walks off the plane, he's so heavily intoxicated that he barely can walk.
Man.
And police just grab him getting off the plane, and you're under arrest.
That stewardess should get like a Medal of Freedom for that. That's incredible.
Hell yeah.
That's awesome.
And I just love the idea that in the 70s there was just Valium for stewardesses.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. I think that will be the name of my autobiography is 2 cheeseburgers and a 30-second head start. I think that's a good title.
Dude, that is a direct quote. Like
that's hilarious. That's too funny. That's too funny. Is it true?
After he gave up the 500 grams.
Yeah. Well, that's a big jump. Is it true, Darren, that this is another thing that I've heard, but I've never seen it in print. And I've heard it on your show and a couple other places, but was there an investigator assigned to the D.B. Cooper case that was later murdered?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So there wasn't an investigator assigned to it. There was a parachute expert that the FBI went to named Earl Cossey. And he was the kind of guy that presented himself as more important than he was. And so he told the FBI, I know everything about parachutes. I know who could have done this. I'm an expert. You guys need to come to me. I packed one of the parachutes that you gave to Cooper. And most of that turned out being not true. But interestingly, this guy lived in a very affluent neighborhood. So not the kind of place where you would be murdered with a hammer in your driveway.
With a hammer?
With some sort of blunt object.
Wow.
And so he's in his driveway with his garage door open. He is struck in the head with something that kills him. And then the only thing stolen is his wallet. His garage door is open.
Wow.
No one's home. You can have whatever you want. He's dead in the driveway. The only thing taken is his wallet. His wallet is mailed back to his mother 2 weeks later.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That's bizarre.
Nothing missing.
Certainly bizarre. So this guy was kind of self-important, overplayed his role in the investigation. We know that. But then this happens. What do you make of that?
And that murder is unsolved to this day.
What do you make of that, Darren?
I don't know what to make of that. There are many people in the D.B. Cooper suspects confidant realm who have sort of met untimely ends. And I think maybe he got involved in something outside of this that caused his end. Also, I've talked to a lot of people in doing this. I'm not a skydiver. I'm not a parachutist. I have one tandem jump to my name.
Good for you.
But I've spoken to many skydivers, long-time skydivers, old skydivers, smoke jumpers, Navy SEALs, PJs. That community is full of crazy, cocky people. And it's just, there's something about I'm jumping out of airplanes for fun that there tends to be an element of people who live on the wild side.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I've had that on my bucket list for some years, but I have to be honest, I've never followed through with jumping out of an airplane.
Yeah, you don't find a group of mathematicians where several of them have died under super mysterious circumstances.
Yeah. But you can for folks who jump out of airplanes.
But you can for folks who jump out of airplanes.
That's interesting.
Even there are some drop zones where the person who owns the drop zone spreads this rumor they're DB Cooper or they're involved in it. It's very common. Another thing about DB Cooper is, depending on who you believe and what you read, anywhere between dozens and hundreds of people have legitimately confessed to being D.B. Cooper.
Which is hilarious to me. All these people on their
But
deathbeds.
it's because he didn't hurt anyone
Yeah.
and the crime he committed was cool.
Yeah. I mean,
Nobody
he's a
in your
cult hero.
neighborhood is committing to being the Atlanta child killer.
Yeah.
That's not cool.
But D.B. Cooper, I mean, very few people from 1971 are still cool today, and he certainly is.
Certainly is. He would have been, 45 at the time, so now he's 95?
Maybe.
Still kicking?
Maybe. But do you ever consider, because this is one thing that I've thought about too, and you made this point earlier when you said that, a crime like that you don't normally commit in your mid-40s. So can't we consider that maybe that estimate was just wrong?
I don't know. You have a 22-year-old gal who sat next to him for hours who said definitively no makeup and mid-40s. And so even one argument that I hate is that, people looked older in 1971. Okay, that's fine. Well, the person in 1971 would have known how people look.
Yeah, that's true.
So
That's
even
true.
though she's 22,
Yeah.
she knows what a 45-year-old man in 71 looks like a lot more than you and I do, Wes.
Darren, I don't like how you just deconstruct my argument so succinctly.
It's really interesting to me because there were a couple suspects that are proposed that are in their late 20s.
Yep.
And, okay, let's say I'm 28 today, Wes. I'm 28 years old. I sit next to a 22-year-old woman on a plane for 5 hours. We get off the plane. You ask her, did the person sitting next to you wear makeup? She probably knows the answer because women wear makeup. Do you wear makeup, Wes?
I do not.
I don't either. And I'm a very poor judge of whether or not someone else is wearing makeup.
Yeah.
Because of that. But a 22-year-old woman does wear makeup and would be a good judge
Yeah.
of, is this person wearing makeup?
And that's a good
I also
point.
think she would be a good judge of, is this person 6 years older than me?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this person 20 years older than me?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. She may have, if he turned out to be 32, she might have thought that he was 25. But probably if he was in his mid-20s, late 20s, she probably wouldn't think that he was 45 years old.
No, she assumed this person was old enough to be her father. That's a big age difference.
Yeah.
I'm 37 years old. If I sit next to a woman who is 22, she's not going to say something insane. She's not going to say that I'm 55 or I'm 25.
Yep.
She's not going to be wildly off. She might be like, oh, well, Darren looks young. I'm saying he's 32. Or Darren is a smoker and he spends his days in the sun. I'm saying he's 43. Those are reasonable. If you say I'm 30 or if you say I'm 45, okay, fine, I get it. But you're not going to say that I'm 25 and
Yeah.
you're not going to say that I'm 50.
Yeah, that's valid. I'm 32 and I have a beard. If I shave my beard, I could pass for 25. You might think that I'm a lot younger, but you're not going to say that I'm 45. I mean, that's just too big of a leap. I think there's definitely validity to that. Tell me about this,
If I
Darren.
could be sexist, I think there is something better about a woman's description than there is a man's description.
100%.
Because, yeah, I mean, Wes, if I sit next to you, I'm like, I don't know how old that guy was. He was between 25 and 35.
100%. I would not know the eye color. I would not know. I would be so bad at describing this man. They would be like, "Weren't you there for 5 hours?" Not really. I don't know. Let me ask you this, Darren. I know at least one time after the incident and the escape of D.B. Cooper, at least once there was some money found that they were able to trace back to this hijacking. Tell us about that, and are there any other times that money was traced back to the D.B. Cooper hijacking?
Why'd you have to bring this up, Wes?
Oh no, what did I do?
So, 1980, Brian Ingram is an 8-year-old boy who is on the shores of the Columbia River on the Vancouver side with his family. His father says they're going to start a campfire. Brian brushes some sand aside with his arm to start this campfire and uncovers some garbage, picks it up to throw it away, looks at it, and was like, what the heck is this? It's a pile of money. And it was approximately $5,800 of D.B. Cooper's ransom.
That's all it was $100?
$5,800.
Oh, $5,800.
$5,800. It was
Okay.
3 stacks
Okay.
of $20 bills with some missing. And the way they knew it was D.B. Cooper's ransom, so he asks for $200,000. How do you get $200,000 real quick? C First Bank in Seattle had $250,000 set aside for a ransom or hijacking
What?
or some crazy situation.
What?
And they had all of the bills on microfilm. I'm using air
What?
quotes because that's what was super high tech in 1971. And so they know all of the serial numbers for this $250,000. He asks for $200,000. It's within that. They had it in 20s and 10s. I want to say it was like 200,000 in 20s and like 20,000 in 10s. So they give him $200,000 in 20s from that ransom. They know exactly the serial number of those bills. Not only do they know the serial number, bills are weirdly similar. So the vast majority of them start with an L, the serial number, which means it's from the San Francisco Mint. Is that the right word for it? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the Mint. I think so.
And most of them had a star note. They were either 1963 Series A or 1969 Series A. And these things don't mean very much to you and me. We would never notice them. But if you are a bank teller or if you are familiar with currency, those are things that stick out right away. So you know this is where the money came from.
Wow.
Markers. And so he gets that money for his ransom. And then the FBI gives a list of non-sequential serial numbers to banks and casinos. Hey, check these 20s to see if they match against this list of 10,000 bills. A ridiculous task.
Right.
But the task of look out for L serial number 20s, star bill serial number 20s, and 69 and 63 Series A 20s. That's not a big deal. And you also have to think about the fact that a 20 is equivalent to a $100 bill today. So if you're thinking a 20 today, you just throw it around and it's what comes out of the ATM. It's how you get gum at the convenience store. It's not exactly the same. And so they compare the Ingram bills to that list. Boom, they're all straight from Cooper's skyjacking. The problem is they're found 20 miles west of the flight path, which if Cooper jumps from the plane, the winds would have blown him east. So not only is it far from where the flight path is, it's doubly far from where he potentially landed. Recent research on those bills has concluded that diatoms, we're getting super deep into it, Wes.
Let's go.
Recent research
I'm
on
loving
the
it.
bills has concluded that the diatoms, which are some like single cell organism, I have no scientists or biologists. But they're like the single-cell organism that can be traced to a time period of the year. Those diatoms on the bills suggest that the money only got wet in the spring or summer. And Cooper's hijacking is in November.
Wow.
So even if he lands in the water and the money washes up there, that doesn't work because that money didn't get wet.
The money was
fall or winter.
The money was
It
planted.
only got wet in spring or summer.
The money was planted.
Who knows? The money is so crazy that it doesn't even answer any questions. It only provides more questions.
It really does. I mean, the fact that it was found so easily by a child, and that it was further away from the flight path, further in the wrong direction from the possible drop zone. And Darren, I always had the assumption that that really the drop zone was just a complete shot in the dark guess, and that it was probably not even correct. But just in talking to you and learning about the radar and the cabin pressure, I'm more confident in the drop zone than I've ever been before.
Okay, well now if I could trash that idea.
Oh, great.
There are Cooper researchers who are suggesting that the actual flight path was west of what we believe to be the flight path. I don't subscribe to that. There are a few that do. I'm more of the opinion, like the FBI and the Air Force were cool with this one flight path. I trust them.
So did DB Cooper throw money from... Could it have wound up on that beach if he threw it out of the airplane? And if so, what would even be the point of that?
So.
I
don't think so. I think if he threw money out of the plane, it wouldn't have landed over there.
Could he have planted it intentionally?
It's possible. Your guess, honestly, is as good as mine on how the money got to Tina Barr. I've said on my show before, I almost wish that the money was never found there.
Yeah.
Because it only messes with this case. It doesn't give us any answers. It doesn't prove to us that Cooper survived the jump. It doesn't prove to us he never spent the money. It doesn't prove to us where he landed. It's not helpful. It poses more questions.
Yeah.
Like, I can't give you a single answer about that money find other than how it was found.
And
I can't tell you why it's there. I have no good explanation for it. I've heard everything from a wild animal brought the money there.
Oh my gosh.
To he landed in the river and a dredge brought it up, and then that dredge deposited their sand at this location, and the money flowed back. There's no good reason.
So this is how
the money got there, in my opinion, is a bigger mystery than who D.B. Cooper is.
Wow.
I think if I actually found D.B. Cooper and he told me the whole story, and I said to him, how did that money get to Tina Barr? I think he would say, I don't know.
That's quite a statement. That's really quite a statement. I don't know. This is just how my conspiratorial mind works, but immediately I've watched too much true crime stuff, but immediately when I hear you say all this, my mind immediately goes to the people that found the money and casts aspersions on them. Is there any possibility that the father of the boy who found the money planted it or had come across it or did this on purpose?
Well, there is one suspect peddler, I'll call him.
I love that.
That has that theory. So in the Netflix doc, Tom Colbert says this guy was at a party and this person said to him, you see those hippies over there? They're going to find D.B. Cooper's money in the next few days.
Whoa.
I've personally spoken to Brian Ingram, who found the money.
You've talked to the guy that found it? The kid?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, and he says that's 100% bullshit. I also, before he told me that, I didn't buy the story. So they're just, I don't believe there's any truth to that. It's such a random spot and location. The idea that it's intentionally planted for the Ingrams to find,
it's hard to believe.
I just don't find plausible. If I was going to plant that money and I'm D.B. Cooper, I'm not doing it there.
Yeah.
I'm doing it in the proposed drop zone.
Yeah. Yeah. So the FBI had access to all of these serial numbers of the money. Is this the only money that has ever turned up?
That is the only money that's ever turned up. Great episode on my show, shameless plug. I had a gentleman named Arthur Friedberg on. And I believe the episode's called D.B. Cooper's Money. But Arthur Friedberg is a numismatist. And he's not a numismatist. He's the numismatist. And as I'm saying that, I realize you have no idea what that means.
I was waiting for you to explain it.
I didn't know until I discovered him. But a numismatist is a combination of historian and collector of currency.
Okay.
And this guy literally wrote the book on U.S. paper currency. It's called U.S. paper currency.
Creative.
The Friedberg system, if you're a collector of currency listening to this podcast, you're obviously familiar with. That is the system of identifying bills. His family came up with that. It's
wow.
Named after him. Like, he was born into this. He knows this. He is testified before Congress. Like, he is the guy for currency in the United States. I was lucky enough to have him on my show. We talked about D.B. Cooper's money, and none of the bills being found in circulation. And he said to me, which absolutely broke my heart, was that the idea that over 9,000 bills enter circulation and not a single one of them comes up on a flagged transaction, he said was impossible to him.
Wow.
It's just, there's no way Cooper ever spent that money.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is, so let's say I steal $200,000 from you, Wes, and you had all those serial numbers recorded. I then take my money, I buy a guitar at a garage sale somewhere. Not a flagged transaction.
Right.
But then those people use the guitar money to buy a Toyota Camry with cash. Well, because it was a $6,200 transaction in cash, it was flagged, they're now going to look at those bills. If one of those 20s was on that list, it pops up. None of the Cooper bills have ever popped up.
Man.
So in Arthur Friedberg's opinion, and he knows a little bit more about money than you or I do, it's impossible. And so I always had this fantasy of Cooper on the beach, drinking a mojito,
yeah,
listening to some news story about D.B. Cooper and laughing. But if he never spent that money, then what was up?
And I'm guessing he couldn't have just put it all in the bank because it would have been flagged.
Oh, yeah.
That actually...
Yeah, so even today, I think today, it's got to be like $5,000 or $6,000, depending on the transaction in cash, where
yeah,
they're going to look at that money.
That's actually kind of depressing. It's kind of a sad...
So where'd the money go?
Yeah, it's kind of a sad thought. What do you even do with that? As somebody that spent so much time, that's so invested in the story, what do you make of the fact that none of that has shown up in circulation?
I don't know. I've heard theories or from some suspects that it wasn't about the money, but
I don't know.
It's got to be about the money, right? Why else
it
are
has
you
to
doing
be.
it? But if the money you can't spend or it's not spendable,
I mean,
then what is it for? Is it for fame and glory?
I mean, who's going to put their whole life and livelihood, the possibility of life in prison on the line, unless the amount of money that you're going to make completely changes everything for you, you know? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know. I have heard some people try to use the fact that the money has not shown up in circulation as proof positive that D.B. Cooper did not survive the jump, and the idea that the money is out there somewhere, maybe in the drop zone, that it's just somewhere that can be found, that D.B. Cooper's money is just, sitting in the woods or in a tree or on a beach. Do you completely discount that?
No, I don't discount that at all. I think the only evidence for him not surviving the jump is the fact that the money was never spent.
Wow.
There is also another, I won't even call it a theory because it's fact, but in 1981, Mount St. Helens erupted, and that's in the drop zone. So that completely changed the landscape.
Whoa.
For most of the area that Cooper would have potentially jumped into.
That's crazy.
It is crazy. So you really only have like 10 years to find him in the woods. Most of that ash, someone who grew up in Ariel will tell me I'm full of crap, but that area was heavily affected by the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So there is the theory he perished in the jump, and then the eruption eliminated any evidence that we could find.
Man.
And I absolutely cannot disagree with that, but I'm not really sure if it's true.
And there's always the possibility. I mean, if you're considering all possibilities, there's always the possibility that he survived the jump itself, but was somehow harmed or injured or came to meet his maker in a different way before he escaped and the money's out there. I mean, you have to...
See, that I disagree with.
Okay.
That I disagree with, because if he pulls his parachute, what's the worst that's going to happen? Broken ankle, broken leg, broken arm.
Right.
I lived in that area. If you broke my arm and dropped me in the middle of the woods, like, I'll be able to find a road or a creek or something. It's not as remote as people say. Like, I really hate the idea that he survives the jump and dies in the woods.
Even if he has a broken leg?
If you die in the woods there, you're in someone's backyard. Okay, maybe they had 70 acres.
Okay. Even if you have a broken leg, you think that you're able to be found?
Yeah, if you pull your chute, 100%.
Okay.
There's no way Cooper dies of dehydration or starvation or hypothermia. There just is no way.
So he dies in the jump or he doesn't die?
Northwest, I don't care. Drop me naked into a random place in the drop zone.
Yeah.
I'm getting out of there.
So he dies in the jump or he doesn't die?
100%. There's no way he gets to the ground and dies after.
Can I throw something wild your way?
After is of old age.
How about this? Can I throw something wild your way?
Hell yeah.
How about he survives the jump, he has the money, he's making his escape and runs into someone in those woods. If I'm in those woods by I try to be a good person, Darren, but in 1971, if I'm strapped for cash and I'm having a hard life and I'm in the woods hunting or in the woods with my gun and I happen to see a dude out there who very clearly has stolen this large sum of money, has a bag full of cash, who's to say I don't just pop him?
You're hunting in the woods and you stumble across a dude with a giant duffel bag full of cash.
Maybe in 1971 after this jump, maybe. Is it possible?
I don't think that's possible. What I think could be possible is that somebody found a dead body with a bunch of money.
Okay, yeah.
And hid that. I really don't believe there's some situation where Cooper lands safely and doesn't get out.
I would put more chips on that side of the table as well. I'm just being a devil's advocate here. So Darren, have you ever either gone yourself or thought about going to the drop zone and search for evidence, search for the money, gone on a treasure hunt? Has that ever been a consideration for you?
Good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that.
Really?
No, I don't think I've ever been asked that. But the answer is no. I grew up in the drop zone. I've been around there a ton, especially like four-wheeling Jeeps. But I don't believe there's much to be had from boots on the ground at this point in time.
Yeah.
Also, interestingly, like, I don't consider myself a DB Cooper researcher.
Okay.
I interview them, I report on it, I follow the story, but there have been very few times where I investigated something personally. There were a few, like, podcast guests where I was, like, blown away, and I was like, oh, I gotta look into this before the episode comes out, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But I'm not trying to solve the case. I just talk to the people who are.
That's very interesting. It's been on, so I have an actual physical bucket list that my best friend and I put together, I don't know, 15 years ago. And one of the things that we put on that list at the time was go on an actual treasure hunt. Yes, we were much younger. But when I put that on my bucket list, I sort of had in mind, even back then, what I meant by that was go look for DB Cooper's treasure. And I realized this far in the future, there's probably nothing to be found, probably no evidence remaining in the area, probably no money, but it's a fun idea.
Wes, do you think you're the first person in 50 years with that idea?
I wish that I were, but no, I do not think so.
No, you can find newspaper accounts of hundreds of people going to look for that treasure. Even into the 2000s, I interviewed a Navy SEAL who was also a Air Force PJ pararescue, and he spent a period of his life looking for it.
Wow. He didn't find it.
No, and he was doing it 40 years after the fact.
Wow. Yeah, probably not going to be the way that I hit my come up, but that's okay. It would be a fun experience, at least see some of nature and say that I've been to the drop zone. That'd be pretty cool.
Plus, if you found the $195,000 or whatever it is, those 20s are worth so much more than $20 that the money's irrelevant.
Yeah.
You're finding a historical artifact.
That's true. I didn't even think about it that way.
So if you find a $20 bill in the woods of Southwest Washington that's a 1963 Series A bill with the star,
it's be worth a ton of money.
Yeah, I'm paying way more than $20 for this $20 bill.
Take that thing to the auction house. You're in the money. That's pretty cool. I haven't even thought about it that way. Well, Darren, let's do this, if you will humor me. I took a look at about 40 to 50 different possible suspects for who DB Cooper might be. And of that list of 40 to 50, I picked out, I think 5 or 6 that either I thought were more probable or that get the most airtime or even that just were the most interesting to me. And I would love to say who that suspect is. I think there's like a short paragraph about each one of them. I'll read that for those who are listening. And then I would love to hear your input. I'm sure you're familiar with each of them. I would love for you to tell me that person absolutely cannot be DB Cooper for the following reasons, or that person might be for the following reasons. Whatever your thoughts about that are. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. The first, and this is a guy that you've already mentioned once, Richard McCoy Jr. And what it says about Richard McCoy Jr. is, over the next 12 months, 15 copycats tried to hijack airplanes by following Cooper's method. but some think that one of those copycats, Richard McCoy, was D.B. Cooper himself. McCoy demanded a $500,000 ransom as he hijacked a plane with an unloaded gun and a paperweight that looked like a hand grenade. He escaped by parachuting off the aft stairs just like Cooper, but unlike Cooper, McCoy left enough fingerprints to get caught. McCoy ended up breaking out of prison with a fake handgun made of dental paste. He spent 3 months on the run before FBI agents tracked him to Virginia and killed him in a shootout. The agent who shot him, though, insisted that he done more than kill McCoy. When I shot Richard McCoy, he said, I shot D.B. Cooper at the same time. McCoy, he explained, had done more than just copy what he heard in the news. He followed a few of Cooper's steps that weren't made public. McCoy's family insists it's ridiculous. They say McCoy was in Nevada celebrating Thanksgiving with them when Cooper made his heist. Some, though, think that they're just giving McCoy an alibi and that Cooper really was gunned down in Virginia. What is your take on Richard McCoy Jr.?
Richard McCoy is a very interesting suspect. The fact that he looks similar to one of the sketches can completely be discounted, as most men from the time look like one of the two sketches.
Yep.
What's interesting about him, though, is his copycat is so similar to Cooper's. He actually improved upon a few of the things that Cooper didn't do.
Wow.
So he gave the flight crew more specific instructions than Cooper did. Not only did he tell him where to fly and how to fly, but he told them exactly where to fly.
Mm.
He ends up jumping out, gosh, I want to say it's like 2 miles from his house, exactly where he wanted. But his execution of the skyjacking is very sloppy.
Yep.
He ends up leaving his demand notes in the terminal, and they actually on the plane like, hey, did anyone leave a manila envelope in the terminal on the plane? And McCoy stating, oh, yeah, that's mine, I need that.
Oh, my gosh.
He drew attention to himself, changing into a disguise in the bathroom. Multiple people noticed his disguise. But he also brought his own parachute on board, which is hilarious.
That is.
Imagine going through TSA with a parachute.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And he was sloppy though.
Yeah.
But the fact that he brought his own parachute on board, they have learned from Cooper's skyjacking. So they put transponders in the parachutes they gave McCoy, and McCoy threw them out the back of the plane.
Wow.
So instantly, they went looking for those other parachutes.
In the wrong area.
They were never opened and in the wrong area.
Wow.
McCoy had his own on the plane.
So would you, in your best estimation, say that Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. not D.B. Cooper?
Oh, 100% not D.B. Cooper.
Okay.
He's too young. His ears stick out.
Yep.
The stewardesses being shown pictures and audio, potentially video, of him right after the skyjacking all said it was not him.
Okay.
There's no evidence to support McCoy. The FBI thoroughly investigated him. They proved he was in Vegas on the day of the skyjacking and back home in Provo on Thanksgiving.
Okay. And
the FBI had him in custody. If there was any evidence that it was McCoy, they would have presented it.
And I think I agree with you. For one thing, if I was D.B. Cooper and I had gotten away with the perfect crime, I wouldn't be repeating it. So that kind of, to me, that sort of is one in the column of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. not being D.B. Cooper. But also, I agree with you. The thing that stuck out to me about him as a suspect is how sloppy he was, how disjointed his effort was in comparison to that of Cooper.
Yeah, Cooper is calm, cool, and collected. McCoy is a hot mess.
Yep, I agree.
And it's not like your first skyjacking is going to be like crazy smooth and awesome.
Sure.
But your second one's going to be messy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so not D.B. Cooper, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. Moving on to the second candidate, one that I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on just because it's such an interesting claim, and that is Barbara Dayton. According to the Foreman family, D.B. Cooper is not a man, she's a woman, and her name is Barbara Dayton. Barbara Dayton was a trans woman born and raised with the name Robert until 1969. She was unhappy with her original gender, but even angry about her eyes. She wanted to be a pilot her whole life, but because of an eye condition, she was turned down by the Air Force and commercial airlines time and time again. After becoming Barbara, she was broke and depressed, and according to the Foreman, started plotting to hijack a plane. She switched back to her male appearance, keeping her wig in a bag and her blouse under her suit, and hijacked the plane. After jumping out, Barbara just had to take off the suit and slip on the wig, and she was nearly unidentifiable. A hospital worker noted that Barbara came in 2 weeks after the hijacking and seemed strangely unworried about money, despite being unemployed and depressed about it for the last few months. The Foremans also claimed that she confessed to being Cooper in 1977. If the Foremans are telling the truth, Cooper died in 2002, and there's a pretty good reason nobody could find him. One of the more interesting possibilities is this one. So, Darren, what do you make of the claims that Barbara Dayton was D.B. Cooper?
Well, first of all, she wasn't unemployed. She was a librarian.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The second thing I'll say about that is, Wes, is there more of a Portland, Oregon story? D.B. Cooper was a trans woman?
That's very valid. That's a valid point.
It's the most Portland story of all time. So, there is this book by the Foremans, Legend of D.B. Cooper, Death by Natural Causes.
Yep.
I recommend you pick it up. Great book. When I interviewed the Foremans, I did it at their home. And so when I read the Foremans book, I thought it was these Seattle, Portland woke people that were trying to sell a book about D.B. Cooper in a woke way.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is bullshit. And they agreed to do an interview with me at their home. I knocked on their door. They opened the door, and the Foremans are the most kind, genuine, nice people I've ever met. I have nothing bad to say about them. They're awesome. And I learned in that interview with D.B. Cooper specifically, like, the Foremans, they aren't lying. This is a story that was told to them by their friend that they love, Barb Dayton. And Barb Dayton told them she was D.B. Cooper. And they believe it because it was their friend that they loved. And it wasn't like some woke hipsters trying to sell a super Portland or Seattle book.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things in this that I've learned. Like, I've talked to a bunch of people that my uncle was D.B. Cooper, my dad was D.B. Cooper,
yep.
My grandpa was D.B. Cooper. Those people aren't lying. They're not making up a story. They're repeating what their loved one told them. Are you close to your grandpa, Wes?
Yeah.
So let's say your grandpa that you truly love, when you're out fishing with him one day, is like, hey man, in 78 I robbed this train and I got away with it. And then your grandpa dies.
Yeah.
Do you believe that story, Wes, or do you automatically assume he was lying?
No, I would be inclined to believe it. Yeah, for sure.
And now you have to try and prove that story. And that's what so many people in the D.B. Cooper world are dealing with. When you talk about, like, these crazy obsessed people. I knew this gal, Jo Weber, rest in peace, whose husband confessed on his deathbed, that he was Dan Cooper. And she spent the rest of her life trying to prove what he said on his deathbed was true.
Wow.
And that's not a unique thing in the D.B. Cooper world.
Right. Yeah, and that's what makes it so difficult to suss through these possible suspects, is that so many people have outright claimed, and a lot of them on their deathbed, to be D.B. Cooper.
Right, and that's like a suspect who confesses in this world means nothing. It means absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
You know, if you're the police in any other issue, it's like, okay, we have someone who robbed this bank. This guy confessed. Let's look into it. Well, with D.B. Cooper, you can't do that anymore because so many people have confessed.
Yeah. Wow. And this story, you know, the story of Barbara Dayton, I just find to be really interesting because it is an outlier and it's so different. But when I looked into it, even just peripherally, I don't see any actual evidence that ties, other than the fact that she told her friends, who seem to be good, honest people, that Barbara Dayton actually was D.B. Cooper. And personally, I would rule her out. How about you?
I wouldn't rule her out. I always say, like, if I could pick who D.B. Cooper was, like, it's up to me.
Yeah.
Darren, you get to choose one of these suspects. Who is D.B. Cooper? I'm picking Barb Dayton.
Absolutely.
Not because I think that's who's most likely, but because I think that would make the best story.
Oh, it's the best story by far. In fact, I'm waiting on the movie made about D.B. Cooper where it does turn out to be Barb Dayton, because that would by far be the best story, for sure, hands down.
Yeah, and it's obviously going to be popular with the woke audience.
For sure. You got that going for you. So we're going to move on to the next one. So you don't rule out Barb Dayton. I kind of do, but that's okay.
I don't rule out Barb Dayton. The one thing that I like about Barb Dayton that gives her more credibility than some of the others is that she throws the money away. It's not about the money. It was about proving that she was still a badass. And
that's
also,
interesting.
She had a grudge against the FAA.
Yeah.
The FAA said she can never be a pilot because of her vision.
Right. Now that I'll give that to you, Darren. That actually is very interesting. The fact that that's one circumstance where you could say it really wouldn't have been about the money. That there's other motives, especially with none of that money showing up in circulation. Okay, you're pretty good at convincing me to have more of an open mind. So I get
I can't eliminate Barb as a suspect.
Yeah. Okay.
So neither should you.
Okay, so I'll say I don't eliminate Barb. I'm not convinced, but I'll leave a little bit of room open. How about that?
That's where I'm at.
Okay.
You know, honestly, I don't think it was Barb, but I can't eliminate her.
And I wish it was. I hope it is. It'd be awesome.
I hope it is too. Barb is the best D.B. Cooper story.
I agree. We're simpatico about that. So the next possibility is another one that you have mentioned already, and this is one I'm just going to go ahead and tip my hand. This is one that I kind of like this possibility, and that's of William Gossett. Cooper told the plane to drop down at the Seattle-Tacoma airport. He'd spotted it from the sky and recognized it, but he knew more about the area than just that. He told hostages that McCord Air Force Base was a 20-minute drive away from the airport, suggesting that he was a military man. At that time, the CIA, this is what you shared, the CIA was using 727s just like the one hijacked by Cooper to drop parachuting agents and supplies behind enemy lines in Vietnam. It's possible the FBI considered that Cooper got the idea when parachuting off one of those planes. That's what makes William Gossett such a strong suspect. He was an Army Air Force veteran in both Korea and Nam, specially trained in parachuting and wilderness survival. An attorney named Galen Cook told newspapers that Gossett was Cooper. Gossett had been obsessed with the hijacking story his whole life, and according to Cook, Gossett had even confessed to a friend that he'd done it. Cook mostly got his story out to tabloids, but Gossett's son thinks that it's true. William Gossett, his son says, was a compulsive gambler who never had a penny, except in December 1971 when he showed up with wads of cash. If Gossett is Cooper, the money did not last long. Shortly after the hijacking, his son says Gossett went to Vegas and blew every penny he had. Which, just reading that last sentence, actually that sort of discounts it because we know that money did not show up in circulation and was not flagged, so he could not have blown it in a Vegas casino.
There is still a small possibility that the money could have been spent, but I don't believe so. Gossett is one of the few suspects where I'm into.
Okay.
I'm into Gossett.
Yeah.
And I've emailed with William once or twice. I've spoken to Greg many times. I interviewed Greg, his son. And I've interviewed a bunch of people about D.B. Cooper. And when I interviewed Greg Gossett, he wanted to have dinner with me right before the interview, which I didn't really want to do because I was worried we would talk about it, and then that sort of ruins the show.
Right.
Because then the answers aren't new and live. I'm asking him to repeat things. But when we had dinner together, the thing he wanted from me was to make sure that I was not out to twist his words and that I didn't have an agenda.
Interesting.
And it was really clear, like that's what he wanted. And then when we started the interview, what became really apparent, and you can hear in the interview, is that he doesn't know. He's not sure if his dad is D.B. Cooper. He's not pushing his dad as a suspect. Greg didn't seek me out so he could be on the show.
Right.
I sought him out to talk to him about his dad. And there were a few things that he showed me that I'm unfortunately not at liberty to talk about.
Are these things you could talk about off
I
air?
looked at these documents.
Could you talk about them off air?
We talked about them off air.
Okay.
Because he showed me a few documents that he had from lawyers.
Yeah.
That they were, how am I going to say this? They were more threatening him with action, I should say, than he was about going forward.
Interesting.
And I looked at those and I saw a couple names and, you know, I did some work on it and it's mysterious. Like, I wish I could say more. Like, obviously I'm being super held back, but...
you've got my interest piqued.
There's something about Gossett that's more legitimate than there is for other suspects. And, you know, William Gossett, a.k.a. Wolfgang, he confessed to 2 different lawyers about this shortly before he died in 2 different states. He also confessed to both his sons on their 18th or 21st birthday, I can't remember, and had a definitive story.
Yeah.
And another thing about Greg that sort of made me intrigued about Wolfgang Gossett was most of the people who I interviewed, it's like, is my dad, is my uncle, blah, blah, blah. They're selling that story.
Right.
And Greg was like, I have no idea if any of this is true. This is what my dad said. I'd like to know, but I'm not looking into it. So if you want to look into it, tell me if it's true or not.
That is curious.
And that was really curious. And his brother is sort of the same way, William, where it's like, this is what my dad said. I don't know if I believe it. And with the Gossett boys, they're not shy to talk shit about their dad. If you listen to my interview with Greg, he says, like, he was not a good father. He did this that was terrible and that was terrible. So it's not like they are trying to prop their father up in any way.
They're not mythologizing him at all.
No, not at all. I do have, with Wolfgang, I do have this, it's possible.
Yeah.
You know, and he was also, like, in trouble with a bunch of women at the time. He was a just completely, obviously a gambling addict. So there was like a money need. He was a survivalist for sure. I find Wolfgang very interesting.
I do as well, and I think the possible CIA ties, the survivalist, his military experience, all of it to me lines up in a way that makes this a possibility. The one drawback that I have is, and I don't know if this is true or not, maybe you have more information, but just in reading this and it's saying that he was obsessed with the Cooper hijacking, that he would just talk about it all the time. That sounds more like a fanboy than the person that did it to me, but I also don't know that that's actually accurate information.
Well, Greg told me that his father was a compulsive liar.
Okay.
And so that's another thing with Wolfgang, where it's like, who knows?
Yeah.
If his sons are telling me he lied about everything.
Man.
So we don't know if this is true or not.
The boy who cried wolf.
The boy who cried wolf. Another, this is me being crazy conspiratorial.
Let's go.
But this is my hot take on the Cooper case. Was Richard Floyd McCoy G.B. Cooper? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's
Agreed.
no way, there's no chance, there's no how.
Agreed.
However, I am interested in the idea that D.B. Cooper and Richard Floyd McCoy knew each other.
They knew each other.
I do toss around the idea that McCoy knew Cooper. Cooper gave McCoy advice on his skyjacking.
That is interesting.
Cooper told him how he did it. Here are the things I would improve on.
Yeah.
McCoy pulls that off. He does exactly what Cooper says, but the one thing he can't do is
get away with it.
Be calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah, which is a personality thing more than anything to me.
100%, and experience.
Yeah, and
like
experience.
If you have a Navy SEAL executing some sort of plan, that dude is going to behave a lot different than you or I.
That is interesting, Darren.
That same plan.
That is so interesting. The possibility that the reason why he knew how to go about this wasn't just because he read it in the newspaper, but he actually knew the person that did it. That is interesting. I've never heard that before.
There were a couple suspects that you could potentially say may have met McCoy. One is Wolfgang Gossett. Wolfgang was Mormon at one point in time. He was in the military. They were both in the greater Salt Lake area.
Wow.
Obviously a stretch.
Yeah.
But there are several different circles that they could have run in.
It's a possibility.
They would have come across each other. The other one is Ted Braden, which I don't know if you're going to bring up Ted Braden.
I'm not. Hit us with it.
Ted Braden in Vietnam, who is a D.B. Cooper suspect that I do legitimately toss around as potentially being Cooper.
Okay.
One of a very small few. Ted Braden is Special Forces in Vietnam. McCoy was a Green Beret in Vietnam. You know, obviously, I'm not saying every guy in Vietnam knew everyone in Vietnam.
Sure.
But there is potential that those two could have interacted with each other.
Yeah. That is so interesting. I've not even heard or considered that thought. I've never heard that before anywhere else. This is the value of having you on my show, Darren Schaefer.
Dude, I've looked into D.B. Cooper once or twice before.
Yes, you have. So we agree then that William Gossett is not someone that either of us would rule out as a possibility.
I would not rule out Wolfgang Gossett at all. There's nothing that I can point to or I can say he's out.
At least from what I've seen, he's one of the ones that interests me the most, for sure. The next candidate is someone that gets probably more attention than anyone else, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts, and then I'll share mine. Robert Wesley Rackstraw. Robert Wesley Rackstraw was a military man with parachute training too, right up until the Cooper hijacking. In 1971, Rackstraw was kicked out of the military for lying about his education. Suddenly, he was strapped for cash. Rackstraw spent 1971 living with his stepfather and floating $75,000 in fake checks to get by. Shortly after D.B. Cooper jumped out of the plane, a warrant went out for Rackstraw's arrest for using fake checks. The police knocked on his door looking for him and found his stepfather lying dead with a bullet in his head. By then, though, Rackstraw had already fled to Iran. He stayed there until 1978 when he lost his job and was forced to leave. As soon as he set foot in America, Rackstraw found himself undergoing questioning for murder and hijacking. There wasn't enough evidence to convict him, but some people have kept the theory alive. In particular, the History Channel aired a documentary about him. But they got in trouble when leaked emails revealed that they had tried to bribe Rackstraw into saying that he did it. The History Channel promised Rackstraw that he could make $1 million in book and movie deals if he agreed to say that he was Cooper in their documentary. Rackstraw turned them down. The History Channel released a show saying he was guilty anyway. Some of that I don't think is quite accurate information. But what do you make of the idea of Robert Wesley Rackstraw as D.B. Cooper?
I actually think all of that was accurate information.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Wes, if you were on a ranch with your stepdad, let's call it a 200-acre ranch.
Mm-hmm.
It's just you and your stepdad. And then all of a sudden, your wife's family finds your stepdad buried in a shallow hole with 2 bullets in the back of his head. You're the primary suspect, right?
For sure. Absolutely.
And that's how it was with Rackstraw.
Yeah.
You know, he was not convicted of that. There's also no evidence that anyone else was involved.
Yeah.
It's not like he was shot in the head and left on his porch. He was buried in a small hole. So, you know, I'm of the belief that Rackstraw murdered his stepfather.
I would agree with that.
As are most people. He was a very slippery con man at that time. He was also way too young to be considered a D.B. Cooper suspect.
Right.
You telling me 22-year-old Tina Mucklow sat next to 28-year-old Robert Rackstraw and assumed he was 45?
Right.
Yeah, I don't buy that. The FBI also had him in custody at that time, so if there was a single thing that linked him to the skyjacking, they would have put it forward. But there was no evidence. The one thing that links him is that he was coy about admitting he was the skyjacker.
Yep.
And I believe that one of the reasons he was coy about that was he thought maybe that could give me some leverage in this case. If I could tell him I'm not, then maybe instead of murder, I'd get manslaughter.
Yeah.
But he was never convicted of that crime. He was heavily investigated, not only by the FBI at that time that found zero evidence to link him to the skyjacking, but he's also been a suspect for a long time, and many independent researchers have looked into him and dismissed him as well.
Yeah.
I was very surprised in 2016 when that documentary, D.B. Cooper, Case Closed, with a question mark, came out, and it was about Rackstraw. And even by then, I was like, this guy's not D.B. Cooper.
Yeah.
And then the episode ends with, we don't think it's him. And then the Netflix one comes out, and it essentially opens with Colbert saying the History Channel doc didn't treat him well.
Yep.
About Rackstraw. And it ends with, he's crazy. He is harassing this guy, and there's evidence to prove that he's not. One of the things I really loved about the Netflix doc was I had only heard rumors that Colbert offered Rackstraw money to admit to being Cooper.
And then they had it on camera.
And they had it on camera.
Yeah.
In the documentary, I got to watch that.
Yeah.
And I believe in the documentary, you can hear me saying, I've heard rumors that Colbert offered Rackstraw money to confess. And boom, there it is.
On tape.
On tape. it's not Rackstraw. I have a very close friend named Nikki who hung out with him a lot. Nikki was his weed dealer. And
Nikki was Rackstraw's weed dealer?
He was his weed dealer and smoked pot with him on the boat and
that's hilarious.
hung out with him many times. And actually there was a producer in the doc named Jim or James something. And that's actually the guy who blackmailed Nikki by saying, I have evidence that you're selling marijuana. And I can either go to the police or you can tell me about Rackstraw.
Wow.
And that's how Nikki got involved in D.B. Cooper. Because this guy's like, this guy you're hanging out with is D.B. Cooper. And we need to know more about him.
Wow.
And he was like, what the hell is going on? I'm being blackmailed. I got to look into this. Who's D.B. Cooper? And he looked into it and in 10 seconds was like, oh, it's not this Rackstraw guy.
Right.
Because I know him. It's not him.
Yeah, and I closed the book on him as a possibility almost immediately. There's a lot of things about Rackstraw that possibly could line up with the type of person that committed this crime or this heist. But when you look at specifics, there's really nothing that seems to tie him there. And I really enjoyed D.B. Cooper, Where Are You? On Netflix. I thought it was interesting. It held my attention. It was pretty dope when you popped up there, and I was like, oh, I listened to that guy's podcast. Very cool. But all the focus on Rackstraw and on Tom Colbert, it didn't really prove very much of anything. It kind of just showed to me, anyway, that Colbert had zeroed in on someone and that he had put so much effort into believing that this was the guy that every piece of possible evidence was going to be. It's like when you mash a puzzle piece that doesn't fit and you just keep pushing it until it goes into place. It's not Rackstraw.
It's not Rackstraw. I mean, Colbert has transitioned from proving it was Rackstraw to just straight up selling the theory. Like, it doesn't matter to him whether or not it was Rackstraw. It's just about selling documentaries and news stories.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
I can do the same thing.
Yeah.
You know what, Wes? I decided your grandpa was D.B. Cooper. What's his name? Thomas?
Harold Anderson. Harold.
100% D.B. Cooper.
Yeah. Let's get the History Channel on the line. I will vouch. He told me on his deathbed, even though I never met him. Let's get the paycheck going. I'm down for that.
Oh, I already called them, and you're not getting a paycheck.
Oh no. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think it was Rackstraw at all. I think he was just.
Rackstraw was only a few years older than Tina Muckle at the time.
Right.
She was 22. He would have been 28. His eyes were the wrong color. From all accounts, he was sporting a mustache and or a Fu Manchu. At the time, he can't be placed in Portland. There's
nothing.
no evidence for that. Rackstraw being Cooper.
He was a huckster, and when they asked him directly if it was him, he was just being coy. And your point about leverage is well taken. I completely rule out Rackstraw as a possibility.
Good. It's not Rackstraw.
Okay, we agree.
I bet my life on it.
Oh wow, you bet your life. I would stop just short. I would bet my house maybe. I don't think I would
bet my kid's life.
Oh my gracious.
It's not Rackstraw.
We've doubled and tripled in the ante there. Yeah,
if Rackstraw ends up being D.B. Cooper, you can cut my son's head off with a sword. It's not Rackstraw.
Don't let your wife hear this episode.
I definitely won't.
That's so funny. Okay, a couple more here. The next one is Lynn Doyle Cooper. D.B. Cooper didn't really call himself that. He called himself Dan Cooper, but a reporter made a mistake and the name D.B. stuck. Dan Cooper, though, just might be the key to cracking the case. He is the hero of a French comic book about a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who's usually shown parachuting on the cover. and he just might be the inspiration behind the caper. If so, that makes Lynn Doyle Cooper a strong suspect. Lynn was obsessed with Dan Cooper and kept one of his comic books thumbtacked on the wall. Lynn's niece Marla Cooper is convinced that Lynn and his brother Dewey were behind the hijacking. On the day of the hijacking, Marla claims her uncle came home with the bloody shirt and said he had been in a car accident. When he thought she wasn't listening, though, she heard him tell Dewey, "We did it, our money problems are over, we hijacked an airplane." The FBI tested Lynn's DNA against a sample they had from D.B. Cooper's tie. They didn't get a match, but there's no guarantee that their sample is really from Cooper anyway, so some haven't ruled out Lynn Doyle Cooper. Are you familiar with Lynn Doyle Cooper as a suspect? What do you make of it?
I am familiar with Lynn Doyle Cooper. I've interviewed Marla. I hung out with Marla at CooperCon. Marla is an amazing person. She's also one of the most charming people I've ever met. Lynn Doyle Cooper doesn't match the description. It doesn't really match the hijacking. He doesn't seem to have the skill set to pull it off. The details don't really match. The FBI DNA profile, I've discussed that a lot on the show.
It's kind of comical.
I've thought about it a lot personally. I've asked FBI agents about it. The profile they had was basically a combination of a few people's DNA.
Right.
And so what they could do with that was rule someone out, but they couldn't definitively say who it was. So it was like, if you didn't have these 8 characteristics, obviously it's not you. But if you do have one of the 8, then potentially it could be you. And so they publicly ruled out a few suspects, but never did anything else with the DNA. I believe they only ruled out Lynn Doyle Cooper, Dwayne Weber, and gosh, I'm not sure on the third. It could be Kenny Christensen, but don't quote me on that.
And that's somebody I did not include in this list for this episode, but I think if I remember correctly, we mentioned on the episode of the show where I covered D.B. Cooper the first time, and that was Kenny Christensen. Do you not consider him a viable suspect?
You know, Kenny Christensen was the suspect I was introduced to when I got into this.
Okay.
And the first person I thought was D.B. Cooper was Kenny Christensen. Based on the avenue that I came into this from. I was like, oh, obviously it's Kenny Christensen. I read Skyjack. I read Into the Blast. So it's Kenny Christensen, and I know this whole thing. But then I got onto the Drop Zone and the D.B. Cooper forum, and I saw people posting things where it was like it's wild with this case, like what gets posted, but it was like, here is Kenny Christensen's personal financial records throughout his life.
No.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was like, okay, well, a couple of the things that was said about him weren't true, so that really eliminated him as a suspect. Also, just the way that he became a suspect was pretty crazy. So he dies, and on his deathbed, he says to his brother, "I have something to tell you." And his brother said, "Don't worry about it, I know." But what's believed that he was saying is, "I'm gay." And his brother said, "I know." Not, "Hey, I'm D.B. Cooper." And his brother said, "I know." And after he passed away, his brother reached out to directors and producers to pitch his brother as D.B. Cooper. And so that automatically, in my opinion, is like, oh, that's not very credible.
Yeah.
You know, if you found evidence that your dad shot JFK, would your first call be to Nora Ephron, the director of Sleepless in Seattle?
No, that would be my third or fourth call.
Right. But
Yeah, that's true. That's a valid point. Kenny Christensen probably was my leading candidate for DB Cooper for a long, long time.
He's a good suspect, and he fits a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But once you really investigate him past that surface point, and the things that are presented about him are really interesting. He died with $200,000 in his bank account. He had this crazy stamp collection. He had a secret room in the attic where he might have stored stuff. He was a flight attendant for Northwest Orient. Mm-hmm. He had these labor disputes. There's a lot of really good things going for him.
Yeah.
But once you really actually start to look into him, it's like, okay, well, yeah, obviously it's not Cooper.
Yeah, there's nothing concrete, and it's nothing convincing, but there's enough things that line up, that, especially from a peripheral view, it's kind of like, well, this guy could be the guy, maybe. And I gotta be honest, even now, I don't think he is DB Cooper, but he's one, kind of like you said with Barbara Dayton, I don't completely rule out Kenny Christensen. I just think that most likely it is not him.
I would say at this point in time, I completely discount Kenny Christensen.
Okay. And how about Lynn Doyle Cooper?
I completely discount Lynn Doyle Cooper.
I agree. Lynn Doyle Cooper does not move the needle for me at all.
No.
Okay. One more, and that is who you just mentioned, Dwayne Weber. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was wandering along a riverbank near Seattle when he found a stash of badly burned money. He showed it to his parents, who reported it and found out they were holding D.B. Cooper's ransom. It's one of the biggest points against Dwayne Weber, a man who was at the very same spot just 4 months before Ingram found the money. Weber told his wife that he wanted to go for a walk alone by the river, which gave him a chance to drop off the money. She didn't think much of it until 3 days before he died, when he told her, "I am Dan Cooper." Weber's wife went to the library and took out a book on Cooper, only to find out that her husband's handwritten notes were all over the margins. She started to put things together, like her husband's nightmares, during which he would mutter something about leaving fingerprints on the aft stairs. Weber was eliminated after a DNA test, although the test was not conclusive. So that's Dwayne Weber. What do you make of him as a possible suspect?
Dwayne Weber is a very interesting one. So if you would have asked me a few years ago what my opinion of Dwayne Weber was, I would have told you there's no chance. And then I would have immediately gone into Joe Weber is crazy, with nothing to say about Dwayne Weber. I've since changed my mind on Dwayne Weber. I had a gentleman on my show named Tim Collins. So there was a HBO documentary about D.B. Cooper. The name escapes me at the moment. I think it was like The Mystery of D.B. Cooper or something. But it came out in like 2020. And Joe Weber is in that documentary. And she's a scatterbrained mess. And in that documentary, they introduce someone as Joe Weber's memory man. And when I watched that documentary for the first time, I knew everyone in the documentary. I had talked to everyone in the documentary.
Wow.
And I was like, okay, this is cool. And then they showed Joe Weber's memory man. And it was the one person, when I watched that, where I was like, who the hell is that guy? How can I not know that guy? And I'm not saying that because I'm like the greatest D.B. Cooper researcher ever.
But you've been in the game.
This community is small.
Yeah.
And the idea that there's someone in this community that knows a lot and I don't know their name is odd.
It's
and
baffling.
I'm not saying that to be a badass, but it's a small group.
Yeah.
It's a small group of people, and I truly know everyone involved. And when I saw him, I was like, I don't know that guy. And I don't know anyone that knows that guy. It was really odd. And so that documentary finished. I watched the credits so I could get his exact name. And I tried to find him. And I found him. And he only lives like 45 minutes from me.
No kidding.
Yeah. And so I reached out to him. I was like, dude, I have to have you on the show. Like, are you really a Dwayne Weber aficionado? Like, that blows my mind. And I thought I knew what I was getting into going into that interview. And it ended up being like 4 hours. And I had no idea what I was getting into. And I left that thinking, like, this guy's smarter than me, and he's done a lot more work than me.
Mm.
And who am I to question his work? And it was good. And I was like, okay, maybe there's more to Dwayne Weber than I thought. That episode ended. I had zero contact with this guy for a year. Like, I texted him, I was like, hey, the episode's out, it's awesome, everything's going good. No response. And then a year and a half later, he reaches out to me like, hey, I want to talk more. And I thought, dude, we did 4 hours. Like, what else is there to say? There's nothing more to say about this.
Right.
And so I had him back out to my house. We did another interview. It went 5 hours. And I left thinking, like, he's on to something. And there was a lot more to Dwayne Weber than I'd thought. And the book Skyjack by Jeffrey Gray, who will one day be on my show, but he's rescheduled like 75 times at this point. But I've been in contact with him for quite a while. And one of the first times I spoke to Jeffrey Gray, he was like, well, what's new? What are you working on? I was like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And he didn't listen to any of it. Like, he didn't care. And then he asked, what about Dwayne Weber? And I was just so taken back by that. And I was like, well, I had this guy on my show, and there's some interesting stuff. And it was a FaceTime or Skype call. And then I saw him just look like he was really thinking about what he was about to say for about 30 seconds, which is a very, very long time on one of those calls.
Yeah.
And then he's like, there's something to Dwayne Weber that is hindered by Joe Weber, his widow, who started pushing the case.
Yeah.
And I found that so interesting. You know, here's where I'll destroy everything I've said so far. Dwayne Weber has ears that stick out wildly.
Sure.
Which, if you're at a bar and then you end up stabbing the bartender and I'm sitting in the corner, the police show up and they're like, hey, that guy that stabbed the bartender, what did he look like? If you had ears that stuck out wildly, you know what the first thing I'm going to say is? He had these ears that stuck out.
Yeah, you would think so.
And Richard McCoy had that also.
Yeah.
Which is never, no one ever says that about Cooper. So,
I don't know.
Dwayne Weber is interesting.
The story.
I wish I could discount him.
Yeah.
I'm sure many Cooper researchers could tell you they discount him, but mostly based on Joe Weber.
Yeah.
So his widow just went on this absolutely relentless pursuit to prove that her dead husband's confession was valid.
Yeah.
Which is why on my deathbed I'm telling my wife and children that I committed some crazy crime, so I know how they'll spend the rest of their life.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know, Darren. I know a lot of people discount Dwayne Weber, but to me, in the ear thing, you're so right. You're so right. Like, it would make sense that would be described. It would show up in the portraits that were sketched. But even so, something about him as a possibility has just always stuck out to me, and I just cannot discount him. He, along with William Gossett. I still have an affinity for the possibility of Kenny Christensen, just because that was like my first crush in the D.B. Cooper world. But something about Dwayne Webber, I just think that is a distinct possibility.
I agree. I can't discount Dwayne Webber. If you would have asked me that 4 years ago, I would have told you there's no evidence, there's no reason, Joe's crazy. But there is something to that. I spoke to, if you want to talk about Joe Webber, I spoke to Joe Webber on the phone.
Really?
In 2018. And I desperately wanted to have her on the show. She was a guest that I would have flown to Florida to do that interview in person because I'm passionate about this.
Yeah.
And also she was one of the people where, in my opinion, that's a big get. That's the top grab.
Oh, for sure.
And when I spoke to her in 2018, at the start of the conversation, I said, "Hey, is it okay if I record this?" And she said no. And unfortunately, I was a gentleman at the time, and I didn't do it. And we talked for an hour and a half or 2 hours, something crazy. And at the end of it, she said, "You know what? If you want to record this, that's okay."
Oh.
And by that point, it was like, well, I stopped it. I'm standing in my backyard now. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
But I also realized, it would be a bad look for me to put her on the air at that point in time in her life. I didn't want to be that guy who's asking her these questions when she wasn't 100% with it.
That's fair.
And the HBO doc came out. Came out. They interviewed her after that point. When I decided it's not cool to put her on the air. And when I saw that documentary, my first thought was they had hours with her.
Yeah.
And they chose a few good minutes.
Yeah.
They also had to have the memory man there at the same time.
Yeah.
Even if I had recorded that conversation with Joe, I don't believe I would have released it. Because, at the end of the day, I love Joe Webber.
Yeah.
I think she's great. And I don't want to put something out that makes her look bad.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about all my guests. I've had guests that say D.B. Cooper was Frank Morris and he escaped from Alcatraz and killed 20,000 people. Which is legitimately what he said. I'm not exaggerating that.
Wow.
And I treated him seriously and took him serious.
Yeah.
And I'm totally fine putting him on the air. But Joe Webber was in a different place.
Yeah, and I've had a guest before that I did the whole interview, and then afterwards, as I was editing, I just didn't feel right. As weird as it is to say, I didn't feel right about how they represented themselves, and I just felt like this is disparaging. There's no way for me to put this out where it doesn't come across making them look badly in a way that's beyond what I'm comfortable with, and I chose not to air that episode. So I totally get where you're coming from, and I think that was the right decision. But you got to have that conversation, which is still pretty cool.
Yeah, I spoke to her 1 or 2 times after that, briefly, but it wasn't like she was super with it.
Yeah. And so for me, I guess if I had to, and I have a limited knowledge about this case, but from what I have seen, the 3 or 4 that stick out to me the most, we're in complete agreement. Barb Dayton, the most fun possibility. That's who I would choose. But Kenny Christensen was my first one that I kind of thought maybe this is it. I've solved it. And then I don't feel as strongly now, but I don't completely rule him out. And William Gossett and Dwayne Webber are the ones that I still get hung up on and think these two really could be D.B. Cooper. Who is a candidate or a suspect that we haven't covered that you would just say this is a major player that I really think possibly could be DB Cooper that we haven't even touched on? Is there anyone that rings a bell for you in that regard?
Oh, hell yeah. Great question, Wes. There is one other suspect
Okay.
where I'm like, there's so much evidence for him. I can't rule him out. It just makes so much sense. And that would be Ted Braden. There is an absolutely awesome book called Paratrooper of Fortune by Drew Beeson. And I had Drew on my show twice, I think. Drew's a good friend of mine. He's a proponent of this suspect, Ted Braden. And Ted Braden is this Vietnam military badass mercenary. He has absolutely the skill set. He has the mindset. He has the ability to plan this. He has the ability to execute this. He has the ability to stay calm, cool, and collected. There's so much going for Ted Braden. The only issue that I'm aware of against Ted Braden is that he's short. He's like 5'8". He's not 5'10", he's not 6 foot. But I'd also argue, Wes, the last time you were on a flight, the guy sitting next to you, how tall was he?
I have no idea.
You have no idea. You're
I have
in an
no
airplane.
idea.
It just sort of distorts height when
Yeah.
you're sitting next to someone. You have no idea. So I will discount the height a little bit.
I mean, that's possibly just 2 inches off. I mean, that's not a lot.
Yeah, it's not a lot. And Drew has done such a good job, especially with family members, which most people don't. He's interviewed several family members that was like, oh yeah, in 72 we had money and we never had that before. He was just this type of guy. Like, he went MIA from Vietnam and was found in the Congo working as a mercenary for cash. And ended up going to Fort Dix. And I've spoken to the commanding officer who was there supervising inmates. And he was like, I remember walking past Ted Braden's cell the first day he was there, and Ted Braden was in full uniform with shined shoes and a belt buckle, smoking a wood-tipped cigar, watching a television. And he's like, what's interesting to me about that is we didn't allow uniforms or shined shoes or belt buckles or televisions or cigars.
Wow.
But this guy had all that, and he was told it's above your pay grade. What's going on with him? And when he went to trial, or when he was supposed to go to trial, he was told there wasn't enough staff that day, so we have to let him go. And he was like, that doesn't make sense to me, the idea we don't have staff, because every single other person here has stood trial.
Yeah, something's up there.
Something is up there.
I'm gonna have to research this guy.
About Ted Braden.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into him. He sounds like a really good candidate.
Also, just the fact that Paratrooper of Fortune was released in the last few years, it is really good because it gives you this more modern narrative. There are several D.B. Cooper books that I've read that are pre-internet, and it's a different world.
Yeah.
Like, if you're reading a book from 1985, they're assuming you can't look things up.
That's a valid point. Yeah, that's valid.
But the more modern books you can. So, if you want to look into a suspect, there isn't a book on Wolfgang Gossett that I could point you to, but there is an absolutely great book on Ted Braden I can point you to. Paratrooper of Justice, Drew Beeson. Drew's a good friend of mine. I'm not promoting his book because he's a friend of mine. He became a good friend of mine because of his book.
I'm going to put it on my book list. Do you just know all of these book titles off the top of your head, by the way?
Most of them, yeah.
Do you realize you've like mentioned probably a dozen books?
I'm like, I got to look at my bookshelf.
That's pretty cool. That you just have dropped like a dozen books on us already. My Amazon wish list is just growing as we speak.
I argue with people on Twitter about D.B. Cooper because I'll go on Twitter and type in D.B. Cooper and see who's talking about it.
Yeah.
And one thing that I don't know, maybe a lot of people experience this, but I've read a few things about D.B. Cooper. I've talked to a few people about this. And to get into an argument with someone that says D.B. Cooper never existed, the pilots created it. And I'm like, I've read 40 books about this, and I've talked to everyone alive that knows anything about this. And you want to argue with me that D.B. Cooper never lived?
Yeah.
That's one thing that drives me crazy. It's that you watched one documentary
and knew it all.
And you know it all.
Yeah.
I've read 40 books about this. I have 50 books about it on my bookshelf.
Done 60-something interviews.
For multiple hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm not pretending I know about this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, clearly you've brought several things out that I have never read, never heard, had no idea of. I'm loving it. I'm finding it super interesting. And I'm going to have to look up Ted. He seems like a real possibility to go along with my list of Dwayne Weber and William Gossett. Let me ask you this, Darren. The one thing that I have learned that I don't know how I never knew this or missed this, but in the Netflix documentary, it went into this a little bit, and I did not know this. I felt really stupid, but the fact that there was in Canada this graphic novel about a paratrooper or an Air Force, some guy named Dan Cooper that parachuted out of airplanes. It was like this hero. What in the world do you do with that information, and how can that possibly be a coincidence?
Well, first of all, I don't believe it was a coincidence.
Neither do I.
I talked to Larry Carr, who was the lead agent on the case from, let's call it 2005 to 2015-ish. And the Dan Cooper comic book connection, they never came across that until like 2010.
Wow.
So you're talking 30 years, 40 years after the hijacking, does the FBI realize this connection?
How in the world did it take so long?
It wasn't published in English.
Oh, okay.
So you have this Dan Cooper comic book, which is some Franco-Belgian comic that was mostly produced in French. There were versions in German and Spanish that were also out, but it wasn't in English for the longest time. Like, I have a Dan Cooper book that's in English.
One of the
but
comics?
It's translations of earlier comic
okay.
books.
That's cool.
And so the idea that this guy walks up to the ticket agency and says, "My name is Dan Cooper." And at the exact same time, Dan Cooper is a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot, stunt pilot, test pilot, daredevil, superhero that jumps out of exploding planes, that skydives, that saves the day, that defuses a bomb aboard a commercial plane. The idea that that name is a coincidence
is
a complete joke.
Yeah.
In my opinion, I use this example all the time, and I used it on the documentary, but if I boarded a train and robbed the train and escaped on a skateboard, and my ticket was under the name Tony Hawk, is that a coincidence that I accidentally chose Tony or Anthony Hawk?
Right.
Or is that a total homage to Tony Hawk, the skateboarder?
Yeah. Yeah, one of my favorite...
everyone agreed that's obviously an homage.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the documentary for sure. What does that mean? Does that mean that there is a distinct possibility that D.B. Cooper was Canadian Royal Air Force, that he maybe just happened to be somebody from Canada that was familiar with the comic book, that he was not even from Canada but just somehow knew about it? I mean, what do you make of that?
I honestly don't know what to make of that. I think the possibility that he was Canadian is 100% legitimate. The only problem with that is that the stewardess said he had no discernible accent. And I had this Canadian gal on my show, Tessa, and she was like, the idea that he's French Canadian with no accent makes me laugh.
Yeah.
And, that's totally true. It's, it would be comparable to, like, the Minnesota mom accent.
Right.
Like, oh, don't you know? Like, that crazy, like, northeastern accent. I don't know what to call it.
Yeah.
But if he was French-Canadian, he definitely would have had an accent that someone from the U.S. would know.
That's a good point.
The other thing I'll say about that is that, Wes, let's say you are a 22-year-old soldier overseas. This is pre-cell phones. You're in some waiting room, some holding area. There are a handful of books and magazines on the table. One of them is a comic book. You're 22 years old. You don't speak French. Can you read a comic book?
Not if it's in French.
Even if it's in French and you don't have anything else to read, you can read Dan Cooper on the cover of that book. And just by the fact that it's a comic book, even though you don't know the words, you can kind of get the story.
Yeah, the graphic aspect of graphic novel.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And so there is some credence in that it was a U.S. soldier, from the Midwest or the West Coast with no accent who was looking at comic books abroad.
That's interesting.
Didn't speak the language. I mean, I have absolutely nothing to back that up.
Right.
But I also have nothing to back up that he was a French Canadian.
Yeah. And I don't...
The only thing is the idea that the name Dan Cooper was a complete coincidence. I just don't buy that.
Yeah.
I don't buy that at all. If I boarded a plane tomorrow and hijacked it and I said my name was Loki, that's not a coincidence.
Right.
That's from the Marvel show Loki.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that necessarily he was Canadian or that he was Canadian Royal Air Force. But I can't, I'm like you, I cannot believe that he accidentally happened to give the same name as this character that shares so much in common from a comic book. I just don't believe that. I think that it was, at least was a character that he was familiar with in passing, if not a comic book series that he was an active reader of. And I know that leaves open the possibility. It just kind of, like everything else in this mystery, it just brings up more questions and more things that we can't know for sure. But I just don't believe that was a coincidence.
Well said, Wes.
Yeah. So what did you think? What was your overall impression of the Netflix documentary? It's like still trending, I think 7th overall on Netflix. DB Cooper, Where Are You? And you got to be a part of it. I imagine that was a pretty cool experience. What did you make of doing that?
I thought it was super cool. They flew me out to Los Angeles to some library to do those interviews.
Very cool.
I didn't tell a single person that I was involved or that I was going to be in that until it came out, because I was very worried that I would be pigeonholed as crazy. So I thought they're going to show me and what I said, but they'll edit it deceptively and be like, these DB Cooper researchers are so crazy. Look at this loser Darren Schaefer and see what he has to say. So I had that concern, because it's not like you say, oh, DB Cooper researcher or aficionado, and you assume cool guy. You assume wacko.
I assume cool guy.
I appreciate that, Wes, but you ask on the street, most people will say wacko.
Okay.
You know, and I've had, no offense to a few people on my show, I've had some wackos.
Yeah.
And I just was really worried that I would come off poorly, or they would edit what I said to agree with their narrative. And as soon as I found out it was going to be a lot about Rackstraw before it came out, and then instantly I was like, okay, I'm never saying anything about this. Because if they edit me to say that I believe it's Rackstraw, I'm like, F those people. Like, that's not what I said. And I didn't want to be in that position. But when it came out, I was actually, like, really stoked. They didn't mess with my words at all. They didn't represent me as believing something I didn't. I felt like I came across pretty well.
Yeah.
In that documentary.
You looked a lot better than Mr. Colbert did, that's for sure. That's for sure.
Although I was at like a crazy period of time with my hair, so I was a little disappointed with that, but who cares?
Yeah. It's just such a cool thing.
It was fun to be involved with, and the director and producer, Marina Zinovich, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, and her husband, Peter Morgan, both really cool people and totally nice to me. You know, I thought they were being nice to me because I was involved in it, and they were going to screw me in the end, but you know, it turns out they were nice to me and didn't screw me in the end. So
best of both worlds. That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was pretty well done. I mean, they did focus a whole lot on Rackstraw, who I just don't think is DB Cooper, but they did it in a way to show the side of this whole mystery where people just get so fixated on one suspect that they believe that is the person, that it's solved. They've been the one to figure it out, which I thought was an interesting kind of approach. So I thought overall, I thought
that was interesting as well.
Yeah.
I really liked the idea that it was somehow about Rackstraw and Colbert.
Yep.
But it ended up making them look bad.
Yeah, it did.
You know, I reached out to Colbert to have him on the show a long time ago, and he was like, "No, I'm not doing it." And so he has this list on his website, like, these are the 40 members of my cold case team that solved it with me. And, you know, there were one or two that were, like, prominent in there, so I just reached out to them. I was like, hey, saw you in this, looks awesome, you want to talk to me about DB Cooper? And the guy was like, oh, hell yeah, I'll do it, I can't wait to do it, I'd love to talk to you about it. And then 2 days later, I get an email from Tom Colbert, like, do not reach out to my team, we don't approve of what you're doing, and stay away from us.
Wow.
And I was just like, wow, like, do you think I'm not going to be kind to you in the interview or your suspect? I just did one about DB Cooper being Frank Morris, who murdered 20,000 people, and I presented his case pretty well.
If nothing else, you are fair on your show.
I appreciate that. try to be fair.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you, by the way, for not having the attitude when I slid into your DMs on Twitter and invited you on my show. I appreciate that. Don't contact me and leave me alone. That would have, I would have. Okay, I'm so sorry. Tom.
I thought about doing that. Here I am.
Thank you. Tom Colbert, I just thought that whole thing just kind of, by the end of it, he no longer looked like a serious person. It looked like he was more just trying to sell something rather than prove something.
Oh, 100%. And, the Cooper case isn't unique in that. I have, my good friend Chris Williamson is like the Amelia Earhart guy.
I love that one too. That's another good one.
And it's a really great one. I'd highly dude, you should reach out to Chris Williamson. I bet he'd do your show, and
I would love it.
Awesome.
Would you put in a good word for me?
100%.
Awesome.
I will.
Bank on it.
But, in the Amelia Earhart case, there's the same thing. It's like every few years this gets solved, and there's this new guy. But here we are just like riding this wave out, and because we've both sort of swam in these pools for long enough, it's really easy to see what's bullshit but being pushed and what's not. And also, there are people who, how can I say this nicely? There are people who find their thing and won't let it go and say, oh, absolutely, it was Kenny Christensen, 100% it was Kenny Christensen. No matter how much evidence you put in front of my face, it's Kenny Christensen. And there are the rare few people who, and I'll give Eric Eulis credit for this all day. Eric Eulis came in like, it's Sheridan Peterson. And then when he got far enough where he was like, it's not Sheridan Peterson, he said that. He's like, I don't believe it's Sheridan Peterson. And I'd like to think of myself that way, although I'm not nailed down to a suspect.
Right.
But there are so many people I've seen where it's like, it's this guy. And then all this evidence is put in front of their face. It's not this guy. And instead of saying, okay, you're right, let's move on, they say, F you, it's this guy. And once you do that, there are so many people that just completely lose respect for you and discount you.
Yeah.
But if you say, okay, I was wrong, it's not that guy, but I want to keep looking at this, people have your back.
Yeah, and that's definitely the category that I would rather be in, is someone that keeps an open mind, that doesn't believe that I have everything figured out, that my perspective is automatically the correct one. I rarely feel like I'm the smartest person in the room. So I try to keep an open mind. I might have my opinions or beliefs, but I don't assume that they're correct.
100% Wes. I've never been in a room where I thought I was the smartest person. I automatically said, I'm a dummy and a loser. So let's hear what these people have to say.
Let me ask you this, Darren. This is kind of, the more I dig into DB Cooper, the more I hear, even some of the stuff that you've shared tonight, it kind of makes me lean towards and feel like the distinct possibility is out there that DB Cooper was not acting alone, and that even if he was on the plane alone and made the jump alone, that he had other people who were in on it ready to scoop him up from the drop zone and take him to safety, that helped get rid of the parachute, that kind of helped him. Do you consider that a realistic possibility?
I think it's 100% possible. The only thing that makes me disagree with that is that two people can keep a secret if one of them are dead.
Yeah.
And so the more people that are involved in this, the less likely I believe it to be true.
Yeah.
So if you want to believe like there's a big CIA conspiracy where 78 people covered this up intentionally, I don't believe that.
I don't either.
If DB Cooper did this on his own and never told anyone, okay, yeah, that's possible. If DB Cooper had an accomplice who picked him up, who helped him out, Okay, that's possible. Does he have 5 accomplices? Not possible. There's no way 6 people
for their entire
took
lives.
this all to their grave.
Yeah.
So the number of people involved, in my opinion, is capped at 2.
Yeah.
And the idea that there was a person on the ground that helped him, there very well could be, but then you have 2 people involved.
Yeah.
And it makes it harder.
It does. And this is one of the better kept secrets in all of history, because first of all, if I had been D.B. Cooper at some point in my old age when I was pretty sure it wouldn't matter anymore, I would have just come out publicly and proved it. I would have been like, hey, it was me. I'm that guy. I'm so cool.
Dude, by Christmas, I told dozens of people. Did you hear about the D.B. Cooper skyjacking a few weeks ago? That was me.
To me, that's the most incredible part of the entire mystery, is that he never revealed himself, as far as we know, unless he's one of these 24 people that admitted it on his deathbed, which I guess is possible, but I don't buy it. That's incredible. But I don't know. I just kind of think, to me, in my rationale, I believe that it is highly likely that D.B. Cooper survived the jump, made it to the ground, and had some person, not a group of them, not a large group, but someone who was there to help with the actual getaway, because the rest of it was so well thought out and so well planned that it's hard for me to believe that the end of that plan was, and then I'm going to land in the woods and I'm going to run away. I think that it was, I'm going to land and then I'm going to have someone nearby in a car and we're going to be out of there before they ever get boots on the ground.
I don't know. I've thought about this. I've thought about this a couple of times, Wes. I'm not going to lie. And in my mind, the way it works is he lands on the ground, figures stuff out, and possibly gets assistance from someone that doesn't realize they're helping Cooper.
Now that's a possibility. Yeah.
He gets right. Hey, can I get a ride back to I-5 from here? Can I get a ride back to Woodland? Can I get a ride back to Battleground? Like the closest cities at the time. The idea. Part of the idea that he has help is knowing where he's going to land. And that one's tough.
Yeah, that's true.
Because it's 1971.
Yep.
He's jumping in the dark with cloud cover. So even if he uses some sort of lit landmark as a guide, he could potentially be miles away from that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
There's no cell phones. Walkie-talkies back then are a joke. So he lands and then has to somehow make contact with someone on the ground, which means payphone or home phone. But Cooper has to get to a payphone. The help on the ground gets into some really weird questions. Like, how does he do that?
That's very interesting.
In 71, it's tough.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That is a fair point, because I'm thinking through a 2022 lens, not a 1971 lens. And back then, especially, even if he had a general idea of where he would land, to be able to be so precise ahead of time, I could see that being next to impossible. I think that's a valid point. What did he do with the parachute?
Well, your guess is as good as mine.
It got buried by the volcanic
probably
ash.
He has to pack it and recover it, and then either dispose of it right away, or keep it with him. And if he keeps it with him, then that's even crazier, because on the ground you aren't putting your parachute back in your backpack.
Right. Man, so many questions. Only questions. Yeah, only questions, yeah.
No answers.
Yeah.
That's the D.B. Cooper case.
It is.
Only questions, no answers.
That's why it's so easy to get wrapped up in it and to just sink into this rabbit hole, because it is questions only lead to more questions. What is the one piece, if there is one, what is the one piece of quote-unquote new evidence that has come out in the last decade or so that you find a lot of validity in?
Without a doubt, it's the diatoms on the Bills in the last decade.
Yeah.
So Tom Kay finds the diatoms in the Bills let's say 2020. It's published in a scientific journal. It is the first instance of diatoms being used in a forensic investigation.
Really?
It is. And just like everything else, it doesn't give us a single answer, Wes. It only adds more questions.
Yeah.
So even if the diatoms said they were of a winter-fall strain, then we could at least say maybe the money got wet that night. Maybe the money landed in the Columbia. But because they're a spring and summer strain, we don't have any answers. It's, okay, well, the money hit the ground sometime and then did this. No one knows.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that is interesting, and it doesn't, you're right, I mean, it doesn't really, it just kind of makes the waters even more muddy, just like every other part of this thing. What is the fan theory that you have come across, or that maybe someone on your show might have mentioned, that is the most fun, but that you put absolutely no stock in at all?
Good question. Most fun, but no stock in. It could be Tommy Wiseau. So there's that theory, like Tommy Wiseau got his money for the room and did all this using his skyjacking money as DB Cooper.
I haven't heard that.
Tommy Wiseau is real coy about his age and
Yeah.
whatnot, but he's definitely not 95.
Right.
So there's no real validity to that. Plus, Cooper had no discernible accent.
Right.
I don't know if you've heard Tommy Wiseau speak, but
Yeah.
no accent is not the way you would describe it.
No, it is not. Yeah, that is interesting. I've never come across that before or heard that.
The other one that I am really amused by, and I've actually looked into myself, is John List. Do you know who John List is?
I do not.
So, John List in 1971 murdered his entire family and his mother who lived with him,
Oh gosh.
and then started a new life somewhere else. And he was a legitimate DB Cooper suspect for a long time because of when he disappeared and his similarity to the sketch. And he ended up being on either Unsolved Mysteries or America's Most Wanted, something like that, in like 1985. And people called in and was like, that's my neighbor. I can't believe it. It's not true, but it looks just like my neighbor. He ended up being found. Going by a fake name. Murdered his whole family. He's on Unsolved Mysteries. 15, 20, 25 years later, he gets caught. Ends up copping to murdering his family and his mom. But not D.B. Cooper.
That's wild.
And he doesn't have the skill set. He interestingly has like a leg injury that would have prevented him from essentially doing it in the first place. He's sort of a square and a loser. You know, Wes, if you're going to admit to murdering your family,
I would think.
aren't you going to admit to doing the train robbery?
I would think so. That's pretty interesting. I mean, that's a wild story, though, that because he happened to be included as a possible D.B. Cooper suspect, it actually wound up with him being found and charged with murder.
It was, and if you look on the Wikipedia page for D.B. Cooper, one of the suspects is still John List.
Wow.
And I truly believe, this is my opinion, I have no evidence to support this, but I believe the FBI thought for a while that there's a potential for this guy to have done this. He looks just like the sketch. He murdered his family. It was literally like 3 months before, and he needed to start a new life.
Wow.
What could be better than a fresh $200,000?
Yeah, no kidding.
So they couldn't eliminate him, but once they had him in custody, he quickly was like, yeah, I murdered my whole family.
But I didn't do this hijacking.
You did do the hijacking.
Like, come on, man. You've already admitted you're going to be in jail. I would have just been like, yep, that was me. I'm the cool guy, too.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got me murdering my family, and I'm admitting that, I'm saying everything else.
Absolutely. I am Son of Sam. I was there with Charles Manson. I'm everybody. I did it all. Already going away. Wow. Well, let me ask you this, Darren. You've mentioned so many books. I mean, it has to be like a dozen at least. If you were just going to pick 3, if someone that's interested in this case that maybe is just learning about it in depth for the first time tonight, what 3 books would you say you must read this?
Good question, and I have an answer for you.
Perfect.
So, if you want an introduction to the case, and if you want a fun mystery attached to it and a good read, I recommend Skyjack by Jeffrey Gray.
Okay.
It's a great book, exceptionally well written by an author who is great. Like, I got nothing bad to say about the book. If you have more than a passing interest in the case and you want to learn the nitty-gritty, I would recommend D.B. Cooper and the FBI by Bruce Smith. There's a 3rd edition out now. It is, I would consider it like the Bible on the D.B. Cooper case. You can trust what's in that book. It dispels other theories, the theories that are unanswered. It shows you that theory and why it's unanswered. Gives you all the details of the skyjacking. Great book.
I'll be buying that
Absolutely
one
great
for
book.
sure.
It is
Yeah.
the Bible on this case. The other book I recommend all the time is if you are debating the issue of whether he survived the jump or not, or if you believe he died in the jump, I would recommend Finding D.B. Cooper by Martin Andrade. I think it's actually by Martin Andrade Jr. and Sr.
Oh, cool.
But that book is absolutely exceptional if you are interested in D.B. Cooper at all. It's absolutely a must-read. It's a great book. You can't argue with it. There isn't, like, theory and conjecture in it. It's just, these are some facts. This is some comparison. This is how it is. And I love that book.
Very cool. Very cool. I appreciate that. I'm definitely, the Bruce Smith book has already been on my list for a little while. I keep a running tally, a note on my phone of books that are interesting to me. And whenever Christmas, birthday, Father's Day comes up and people start asking, I just text it to them like, hey, give me 3 or 4 of these books. Let me ask you this. What's next for you, Darren? The Cooper Vortex, you have like 60 some odd episodes of the show out. Is that something that you're looking to continue doing? And are you going to have further interviews coming up? Are you working on another project? What's coming up for you?
The Cooper Vortex, I've tried to end it a few times, but like the name, you get sucked in and you can't escape. So
It's a vortex.
I have a few episodes booked and in the works that should be pretty good. I have a guy that owns a 727.
No kidding.
That's coming on. I think I'm interviewing him Sunday.
He has his own personal 727.
Correct.
That's wild.
So he has a couple more bucks than you and I will.
No kidding. No kidding.
Jeffrey Gray is going to be on the show, he says. I know I've probably said that 1,000 times if you're a big fan, but I'm working on him. He keeps saying he's going to come on. I've rescheduled that a few times. That should be pretty good. Larry Carr was the latest episode and one I'm super proud of.
Mm-hmm.
That was a guest that I had honestly worked on for years.
Really?
And his scheduling, like, he told me I can come on in the fall of 2022.
Oh my gosh.
And this is like 2020. And I'm like, okay, fine. I'll hit you up then. And it's just like defeated. And he hits me up. He's like, hey man, I'm retired in a week. When do you want to do this?
Oh wow.
And so that episode I'm very stoked about because it was a long time coming.
No kidding. No kidding.
It was a long time coming. Yeah, and I have one or two more of those episodes coming out. I don't want to water that show down with people who shouldn't be on.
Yeah.
And I have had a few guests on that show that shouldn't have been on. And now I'm getting a lot more of those requests, but I'm a little bit pickier than I used to be.
Sure. Yeah.
But the other show that I'm working on is The Book of Darren. And that's just my same interview style, but without a crazy niche of a 50-year-old skyjacking.
So would that just be interviewing people from all walks of life that you find to be interesting?
Yeah, I had Chris Williamson on, the Amelia Hurt guy. Scott Fuller, which is like an old school radio newspaper guy. Bruce Smith was on.
Very cool.
And instead of D.D. Cooper, Bruce Smith is a big mystical guy.
Okay.
And so we got into some of the more woo-woo stuff with him.
Cool.
But yeah, that's more what I'm working on now. I really love podcasting and doing interviews, being interviewed.
So much fun.
So I created a show where I could, just talk to interesting, awesome people without...
I love it. Is that show out already?
Yeah, that show's out. You can find it on wherever you get your podcasts.
Okay. Awesome. The Book of Darren. Very cool. I'll check that out as well. I gotta say, I love the Cooper Vortex. I love the way that you set it up, the way that you do interviews. I'm just like you said earlier. I have not listened to it sequentially. I sort of just scroll through the ones that I haven't listened to yet and pick one that sounds fun, and that's how I've been listening. I'm a little over halfway through the episodes that you have posted. Darren, is there anybody that you'd like to shout out or anything that you'd like to promote in addition to your podcasts?
Chris Williamson. He has the show Vanished. That the first season was Amelia Earhart. He has a separate Amelia Earhart podcast. He has a book, Rabbit Hole, about Amelia Earhart. A great dude. I love all of his work.
Awesome.
There is also another person. I'll promote his work even though he hates me. Bryce Blankenagel.
What a name.
Does a show about Mormonism.
Oh, okay.
Called Naked Mormonism.
Naked
that
Mormonism.
I absolutely love. I think it's one of the best podcasts ever.
Wow.
It's one of the things that inspired me to do my own podcast. I got semi-close with him, and then I somehow offended him. I'm not sure how. Actually, maybe I know how. But I love him. I think his work is incredible. I have nothing bad to say about him. Naked Mormonism is awesome. Support Bryce Blankenagel.
And he has a really cool name, Bryce Blankenagel. That's a great name.
It is a great name.
Just rolls off the tongue.
Too long, but still a good name.
Well, listen, I gotta tell you, Darren, it's been an absolute honor to have this conversation with you. I thought that it would go like an hour and 15 minutes. Here we are at 3.5 hours, and it's just been so interesting. I've learned a ton. My head is spinning. All kinds of things that I've never heard or read anywhere else before. You brought the knowledge, and just your kindness and your your willingness to come on a show of someone that you've never heard of or met before with a day's notice is the kindest thing that anyone has done for me in podcasting so far. So thank you so much for being on the show tonight. Wonderful conversation. This has been my favorite episode to make, and I can't wait to get it out there to the audience. We appreciate you so much.
Well, dude, I love you, Wes, and my only regret in this episode is that I actually wasn't in the shed with you to record this.
It's hot in here, man. I don't have any AC, no heat. So in the winter, I'm out here recording, and it's 30 degrees. In the summer, it's like 100. I just sweat it out. I just grind it out. You know, all 105 of the people that are going to hear this episode are going to love it. And but I say all the time, I do this for me. And I do it for them. We're very popular for some reason in India, so you'll have a lot of new fans over there. But man, I really do appreciate it, Darren. Darren Schaefer, everybody. Please check out his podcast, Book of Darren. Check out the Cooper Vortex. You will not regret it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Wes. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, sir. That's all for this week. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. I can't either. It's back in the house and out of the shed for me. Thanks again for listening to episode 45. Make sure to subscribe, like, share, and review. It really does help. If you have any paranormal experiences, opinions about sports, or politics that you'd like to share, you can email the show at intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. Again, that's intheshedwithwes@gmail.com. I might even read it on air. Look for us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, the Good Pods app, or wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure to follow us on Twitter at InTheShed4. Tune in again next week when we'll hit the headlines, preview the SEC West, and investigate together the mystery of the Georgia Guidestones. This has been In the Shed with Wes Anderson, the best news show in the land covering politics, sports, and the paranormal. Have an adventurous and fulfilling weekend. I'll catch you tools later. Peace out, Boy Scouts. Meemaw, we made it!